Chapter 1151. He took a deep breath. I must immediately return to the royal bloodline. Farewell. He lifted a hand, about to tear open space. The old turtle's aura vanished, and there was no way for the ancestral land to continue sealing away a true king. Qin Yu lightly said, King Profound Strategies, I fear you don't truly understand my meaning. He looked into King Profound Strategies' gloomy eyes. The fragment of the shadow of betrayal has already taken root in your shadow. After a period of nurturing, it will complete its rebirth. At that time, it will slowly swallow up your shadow. Believe me, there is no way for you to stop it. The final result is that you will completely lose your own will and become a puppet that is possessed. King Profound Strategies coldly said, How can you be sure? Qin Yu said, The reason I can be sure is because I know that the shadow of betrayal splits into is called the time immortal body. He paused for a moment, his voice becoming increasingly low. The general meaning of this name is that even the fleeting flow of time cannot destroy it. You should understand that time is undoubtedly the most formidable and irresistible force in this world. Time immortal body, Monarch Xuanji's pupils shrank. Although this was the first time he had heard this name, the moment he heard it clearly, he felt a cold fear rise from the bottom of his heart. Like a stone falling into the water, it caused ripples that gradually spread throughout his body. He felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. His intuition told him that what Qin Yu said was true. He looked down at the shadow beneath him, as if he were staring at a bottomless black hole. It was like a gaping maw, diabolically grinning as it waited for him to fall into the abyss. Cold sweat instantly covered his forehead and his complexion paled. This was because it wasn't just the old turtle that feared death. In fact, all living beings in the world instinctively feared death. Correspondingly, the stronger one was, the longer they lived, and the more intense their fear of death would be. The cold cruelty in his eyes slowly faded away, replaced by fear and restlessness. King Profound Strategies stared at Qin Yu. What else do you know? Qin Yu said, I know how to save you. King Profound Strategies fell silent. He didn't doubt Qin Yu. If he could say the name of the time immortal body, then it wasn't impossible for him to save him. He took a deep breath and said, What do you want? Qin Yu smiled. I lack a powerful servant. Impossible. King Xuanji roared. His eyes widened as he glared at Qin Yu, anger burning within him. In any other situation, if Qin Yu dared to say such words, he would immediately be torn to pieces. This was the greatest humiliation to a true king, but the situation was stronger than him. No matter how angry he was, he had to endure it for the possibility of survival. Qin Yu, you should be well aware that in order to reach the true king realm, you must obtain the approval of the abyss, will, and fuse with a portion of the abyss's source. Strictly speaking, all true abyss kings have become a part of the origin of the abyss. It's impossible for me to become your servant. After pausing for a moment, he still said these words that were extremely humiliating and infuriating. Qin Yu put on an enlightened expression. He nodded. So that's how it is. It seems this junior is ignorant. He paused for a moment before continuing. Then, let's change the condition. Senior, please stay by my side for a period of time. Let's tentatively set it as 100 years. Once the time limit is over, you will regain your freedom. He looked at King Xuanzi. To a true king, 100 years is nothing more than the blink of an eye. Compared to life or death, it isn't worth mentioning at all. Moreover, Junior guarantees that during this period of time I will give Senior sufficient respect. This was a type of negotiation technique. First put forth a request that was absolutely impossible. After being rejected, one could retreat and ask for the next best thing. This way, it wouldn't be easy to be rejected again. Moreover, Qin Yu's words were extremely tempting. Compared to life or death, 100 years was nothing at all. King Xuanzi's complexion was cloudy and uncertain. Flames burned in his heart, burning his eyes red. as a formidable true king with the Netherworld king bloodline. When had he ever felt threatened like this? Very well, I agree. If he could suppress Chinyu, then he could think of a way to force out everything from his mouth. But King Xuanzi didn't have full confidence. This was because Qin Yu's performance just now had been far too fierce. Who knew what other cards this brat had in his hands? If he provoked him, he couldn't die. He was alive and well, so how could he die? 100 years would pass in a flash. At that time, he could think of a way to settle accounts with Qin Yu. Humph, humph, humph. Did he really think that he wouldn't need to pay a price to humiliate a solemn true king? Qin Yu smiled. King Xuanzi, don't worry. I will soon help you take away the undying body fragment that is fused with your shadow. As he spoke to her, he looked at King Xuanzi, and his smile became even brighter. With a stuffy cough, King Xuanzi clenched his teeth and said, I swear upon my source that I will follow Qin Yu for 100 years. If I violate this oath, I will be rejected by the abyss. An invisible binding force immediately appeared. This was an instinct of the abyss's will and wouldn't arouse its attention. Qin Yu felt this binding force and his heart relaxed. Although he had a high chance that King Xuanzi wouldn't turn hostile because of this, before things had truly come to an end, any change could occur. Now, the situation had truly entered into a rhythm that Qin Yu controlled. Elder arcane magic felt as if he had just watched a wonderful drama. Although, strictly speaking, this drama was dry and the time it lasted was extremely short. Whether it was wonderful or not depended on the content. A solemn true king of the abyss was actually forced by a demon commander level junior to bow his head and be ordered around for 100 years. Well, even if this brat Qin Yu was incomparably abnormal and couldn't be viewed with common sense, he was still only a demon commander. Throughout the endless years of the abyss, let alone seeing something like this, they had never even heard of it. It was simply inconceivable. This was without a doubt a great show. Once this matter was spread out, King Xuanzi's old face would be thoroughly lost. The entire Netherworld royal bloodline would also be covered in dirt. This matter slightly washed away the gloominess of not having obtained anything in the end. But Elder Arcane Magic's attitude of watching the fun didn't last too long. As he felt Qin Yu's eyes fall on him, his heart chilled and he revealed a vigilant look. What did this brat want to do? He never imagined that a solemn true king of the abyss would reveal such an expression because of a junior's gaze. This was truly shameful. Qin Yu said, Elder Arcane Magic, can you keep today's matters a secret? Arcane Magic's heart chilled. He immediately thought of a possibility and said, Of course. I can guarantee that I will not tell anyone. Qin Yu waved his hand. I don't believe you. Arcane Magic. Bastard, if you don't believe me, then why are you asking me? Are you deliberately playing with me? Qin Yu turned his head. King Xuanzi, do you believe me? After all, I need time. King Xuanzi was silent. This silence clearly represented some sort of attitude, because he already understood what Qin Yu was saying. The shadow of betrayal had been destroyed, but there was still a remnant left on his body. In normal circumstances, the chances of the will of the abyss detecting it were very small, but what if someone reported it? The abyssal demon dragon race had obtained the recognition of the abyss. If they made a small report, it would be far too easy. Perhaps they could even obtain a reward from the abyss. This was such a simple matter. Even if King Xuanzi thought about it, if he were in Qin Yu's shoes, he would also be tempted. Of course, there was another hidden reason that couldn't be said out loud. That was, why was he the only one who was unlucky? You are a true king of the abyss, but so am I. Since I've fallen into a pit, it would be best if I could pull someone else down with me. At the very least, I could make that old demon dragon Arcane Magic shut up and never speak of this shameful matter. Qin Yu looked away. Elder Arcane Magic, look, even King Xuanzi doesn't believe me. Elder Arcane Magic's complexion paled and his eyes darkened. He roared, Qin Yu, do not forget that I came here today in accordance with the contract to help you. This is how you repay kindness with enmity. Qin Yu said, "The reason you gave me the contract is because someone has given you enough benefits. This is only a transaction. I don't owe you anything." As he spoke, he lifted a hand and pointed a finger forward. An invisible aura was released, pouring into the ancestral land space. It was still broken and hadn't been completely repaired. But at this moment, it suddenly restored a bit of its imprisoning ability. It hadn't reached its peak, but even a true king of the abyss couldn't instantly shatter it. In other words, that old dragon arcane magic could forget about escaping. This brief delay was enough for King Xuanzi to stop him. The face of the angry arcane magic stiffened. He stared at Qin Yu, an ominous light flashing in his eyes. This hateful little bastard. He had been secretly gathering his strength just now, so that he could shatter the space of the ancestral land and escape from here. But before he could do anything, Qin Yu had moved, completely blocking off his escape route. "Smart enough and decisive enough. You're ruthless enough." Elder Arcane Magic wasn't in the mood to continue acting. He coldly said, "Speak, what do you want?" He glanced at the silent King Xuanzi. "I'm warning you in advance. Do not try to make any impossible requests. If worst comes to worst, I will fight you. You might not be able to keep me here." Qin Yu said, "Of course. I believe that Senior does indeed possess such formidable strength. But I also believe that you should understand that if Junior joins forces with King Xuanzi, there's still a small chance that we can kill you." Elder Arcane Magic remained silent. This was because he knew that Qin Yu wasn't wrong. Qin Yu's lips curved up in a smile. "So this Junior's request is that you give me another contract, just like the previous one." Arcane Magic's complexion instantly became ugly. As he looked at Qin Yu's smiling face, he gnashed his teeth together, wishing he could tear Qin Yu into pieces and chew him to pieces. This little bastard, when he first gave him a contract, he ended up in such a situation. If he gave him another contract, would he end up any better? Perhaps he would even be toyed to death. No, just as he was about to speak, he was interrupted. Qin Yu had a serious expression. "Elder Arcane Magic, what Junior says is true. Please consider it and don't make things difficult for me. If I could choose, I really wouldn't want to be enemies with a formidable existence like you." Was this a form of flattery? But who cared about that? Arcane Dharma wished he could slap Qin Yu to smithereens. This damned brat, he was clearly threatening him. Finally, Arcane Magic chose to agree. This was because when the contract was signed, he tacitly agreed that he couldn't harm Qin Yu. Otherwise, he would suffer a backlash from the contract. Since King Xuanzi and Qin Yu's interests were one, this also guaranteed that Arcane Magic wouldn't reveal anything. This little bastard, he was quite thoughtful. Qin Yu put away the contract and bowed. "Farewell, Senior Arcane Magic." Humph! Arcane Magic flicked his sleeves and shattered space. The moment he stepped in, Qin Yu's voice sounded out once more. "Teacher Liao gave me something just now. He said that it might be useful to you. Consider this Junior's apology." Pa! Arcane Magic reached out and grasped the demon crystal. After determining that there was no threat, he probed it with his divine sense. In the next moment, his body shook. He took a deep breath and glanced at Qin Yu. Then, without hesitation, he stepped into the spatial crack. Shwa! Arcane Magic's aura vanished. King Xuanzi wanted to know just what Qin Yu had left in the demon crystal that could cause the old demon dragon to reveal such a shocked expression. He glanced at Qin Yu. He originally thought that this boy would explain, but Qin Yu didn't do so. "Senior King Xuanzi, before we leave, we should make some preparations, after all. I will need Senior to help me put on a play." The entire Evil Peaks city fell into a deathly silence. Countless eyes widened, bulging out like fish out of oxygen, their faces dull and lifeless. This was because the vortex in the skies had suddenly shattered. That's right, without any warning. Like a bubble, it completely disappeared with a pop sound. In the records of the nightmare race, This had never happened before. No one knew just what had happened. But without a doubt, a massive change had occurred. They urgently wanted to know what sort of impact this change would have and what sort of changes it would bring to the nightmare race. But now all they could do was wait. Just at this moment, the sky above Irving City was suddenly shattered. A figure appeared from within and took a step out. Chapter 1152. The Demon Dragon Race's Elder Aofa. How could it be him? Ancient King Clan Leader, Old King Clan Leader, and new faction Hong Chang's expressions changed at the same time, and they subconsciously took a step forward. Without waiting for them to speak, Offa shouted in a low voice with a cold expression, "The new Nightmare King has been born. It's just behind us." With that, he took a step forward, toward open space again, and vanished. A new king has been born. Who could it be? What had happened in the ancestors' land? It was as if 100 claws were scratching at his heart. If it wasn't for that old demonic dragon, Offa, being extremely powerful and his back being shockingly large, he would have long since been captured and interrogated. As for now, the only choice was to continue waiting. Fortunately, the anxious wait did not last for too long. The sky shattered once more, and a figure appeared once more. At first, it was blurry, but it quickly became clear. Yun Wuya's eyes widened in ecstasy, and he couldn't help but throw his head back and laugh heartily. Qinyu! It was Qinyu. His laughter resounded throughout the entire Evil Peak City. In the azure tile courtyard, when Yunlon heard Yun Wuya's laughter, he immediately relaxed, and a smile appeared on his pale face. He won. Qin, you stepped out from the shattered space. That's right, he was alone. His eyes fell on the ancient King Patriarch, the old King Patriarch, and the new faction's red dress. After pausing for a moment, he smiled. 3 clan leaders. Do you have any objections to me seizing the throne? A sliver of pressure was released from his body, and the expressions of the 3 nameless true monarchs changed. The pressure of the true Abyss King was not wrong, and this aura was indeed the pure aura of the King of Nightmares. But for some reason, when they looked at Qinyu, they felt that something was wrong. The old royal family patriarch's eyes flashed. He was the first to step forward and bow. Nightmare Yun family patriarch greets my king. No matter what, Qinyu represented the old king's bloodline. If he were to seize the throne in the end, that would be the best result for them. Hong Chang was the second to bow. Her bright eyes fell on Qinyu's face. Hong Chang greets my king. The Guwang clan leader sighed in his heart, but he knew that the current situation was beyond his control. He respectfully followed behind the 2 and bowed. Greetings, your majesty. In the next moment, all the demons in Irving City knelt on the ground. Bang! Above the endless vault of heaven, an aura suddenly descended. It was boundless and vast, instantly pouring into Qinyu's body. His black robe fluttered even though there was no wind, and a powerful aura erupted in an instant. The oppressive aura that belonged to the true Abyssal King swept out in all directions. This was the recognition of the will of the Abyss. The aura that fused into Qinyu's body was the strength of the source of the Abyss. It represented the confirmation of his status as the King of Nightmares. There were no surprises. Qinyu's heart relaxed. He swept his eyes over the prostrating ancient king, old king, and new faction. He lightly said, I know that all 3 of you are curious and puzzled. Come with me to the blue tile courtyard. If I can explain, I won't hide anything. Of course, it would be fake if he didn't hide it. But since Qinyu hoped to truly grasp the position of the King of Nightmares, he had to think of a way to dispel the suspicions of these 3 old demons. Otherwise, he, the fake King of Nightmares, wouldn't be able to suppress the 3 nameless monarchs. He would be defeated if he wasn't careful. A moment later, in the hall of the blue tile courtyard, Qinyu's former residence, he sat in the seat of honor. He lifted a hand and pointed a finger in the air. An invisible imprisoning strength immediately descended, completely sealing off the inside and outside. Feeling this imprisoning strength, the complexions of the ancient old king patriarch, and Hong Chang all changed. So strong! Moreover, he gave them a faint feeling of threat. The strength that Qin Yu displayed right now was far greater than what the new faction king had displayed before. In the abyss, strength was the true status. The expressions that the three old demons revealed became a bit more restrained. Qin Yu said, "The ancestral land has been destroyed. That existence that exists within will never appear again." The complexions of the ancient old king patriarch, and Hong Chang changed. They never thought that Qin Yu's first words would contain such explosive news. The ancestral land had really been destroyed before. When the vortex vanished, they already had a faint guess in their hearts. In the end, this was the nightmare ancestral land, and its aura was connected to the entire tribe. As the true monarchs of their tribe, they were certainly able to sense it. But now that they received confirmation from Qin Yu's own mouth, the impact of their emotions still shook their hearts. Qin Yu waited for a moment, allowing them to digest this news. Then he continued to say, "Now, the three of you can ask your questions. I must say in advance that there are some secrets that I can only conceal." Hong Chang was the first to speak. Just who is that existence within the ancestral land? She paused for a moment, her tone becoming increasingly urgent. Or, to be more precise, what is his relationship with the Nightmare tribe? Qin Yu glanced at her and said, "That one, strictly speaking, should be considered a parasite hidden within the Nightmare race." Of course, saying that he is the old ancestor of the Nightmare tribe isn't wrong, because it is because of his existence that the Nightmare tribe has its current status. Hong Chang frowned. She clearly wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Qin Yu waved his hand, interrupting her before she could speak. "I know what you want to say. Fine, I can tell you the truth. But this matter is far too important and cannot be revealed in the slightest. Otherwise, the Nightmare tribe will be exterminated." The ancient old king patriarch, and Hong Chang sucked in a deep breath, their heartbeats instinctively accelerating. Qin Yu's eyes swept over the three of them. He slowly said, "The existence within the ancestral land is a shadow of the abyss." Then he explained the situation. Simply put, it was 90% true and 10% false. After Qin Yu's words were processed, the story was still the same, but it had a different flavor. As the three old demons listened, their complexions changed again and again. They constantly verified what they already knew, and then everything matched up. No wonder, as long as one was chosen to enter the ancestral land and seize the throne, they could directly become a true abyssal king. No wonder all previous abyssal kings, no matter what race they came from, gave off an essential feeling of familiarity. No wonder the relationship between the ancestral land and the Nightmare tribe wasn't close at all, and even gave off an icy cold feeling of plundering. A shadow that developed its own will and resisted the abyss, unwilling to dissipate. So, this was the reason why the Nightmare tribe was able to rise. But was he really just a simple shadow? Moreover, this shadow had vanished. In other words, the Nightmare tribe had lost their ancestral land. Although they had already thought of this possibility, when they truly faced the present situation, they still instinctively felt lost. In the future, would the Nightmare tribe still be able to maintain their status today? Or could it be said that with the disappearance of the ancestral land, they would inevitably fall into a state of weakness and eventually collapse? The old king patriarch slowly said, "Although this is a bit offensive, I still have to ask, what is your true identity?" Qin, you could feel the eyes that gathered on him. It was clear this was one of the things they cared about the most right now. It was no less important than the true secret of the ancestral land. This was because Qin Yu was the current Nightmare King. He controlled the entire tribe and could control the future and rise and fall of the tribe. The will of the abyss cannot be disobeyed. Since a shadow of betrayal was born, it would naturally think of a way to thoroughly erase it. Marquis Qianjun was an executor, but his actions were too slow. Thus, I appeared to erase the mistake and return everything to the right track. Qin Yu faintly smiled. This is my identity. He didn't directly answer, but this answer was clearly enough. The ancient king patriarch, the old king patriarch, and Hong Chang nodded inwardly, thinking that this was indeed the case. Like this, the identity of Marquis Qianjun had been taken. Moreover, the matter of his sudden disappearance had been quietly resolved. There was no need for a useless executor to continue existing. It was normal for him to be eliminated by the will of the abyss. Moreover, Qin Yu's actions had caused the three old demons to believe his words even more. This was because they had long suspected Marquis Qianjun, and now that they had confirmed many things, everything became clearer. At this point, the three old demons believed 70 to 80% of Qin Yu's words. In fact, this was already a very good result. Without staying for too long, the ancient king patriarch, the old king patriarch, and Hong Chang bid their farewells and left. As he watched them leave, Qin Yu frowned. He immediately relaxed and said in a soft voice, "They are indeed cautious enough, but it doesn't matter. As long as I am not exposed on the spot, I have passed the most difficult hurdle. From now on, I am the new Nightmare King." Even with Qin Yu's shrewdness and intelligence, he couldn't help but feel his heart surge with excitement. As a life form of the vast Yang world, he had actually become the Nightmare King of the Abyss. This was simply inconceivable. After a long time, Qin Yu took a deep breath and slowly suppressed his surging emotions. He looked down at the shadow beneath him, anticipation in his eyes. Now is the time to take inventory of my harvest. Chapter 1153. Qin Yu had never forgotten his most fundamental goal for entering the abyss. Thus, after awakening the undying body fragment of the old turtle, he directly asked about the secrets of the myriad soul Tao. This was related to Ning Ling's life and death. Myriad soul Tao. The old turtle thought for a moment. His complexion changed. He glanced at Qin Yu's complexion and subconsciously gulped. He wasn't an idiot. Moreover, with Qin Yu's current appearance, even an idiot could tell that there was something else going on. Could it be that he had cultivated it? No, that wasn't right. Qin Yu's soul aura was still complete. It hadn't been divided. Then what was the reason? Without giving the old turtle any more time to think, Qin Yu said, "Tell me everything you know. If you dare to hide anything, I will crush you." The old turtle's face turned green. Qin Yu's attitude was serious, and he feared things were even worse than he thought. He gulped. "Don't ask me why my shadow can also gulp. After all, this shadow is a projection of the abyss, so of course it's different. The myriad soul Tao was an experiment I made. You also know that I am a bit afraid of death, so I always wanted to leave myself a path of retreat. Thus, I came up with an idea. I split my own consciousness and used it as a seed. Then I would constantly strengthen myself and finally fuse them together. Perhaps that would be able to greatly increase the strength I possess. The Qi Zhen that you worked with, as well as the other shadows, were just some of my attempts. Ahem, ahem. Imagination is beautiful, but reality is often cruel. In short, I failed. The myriad soul Tao was wrong in the first place." The old turtle paused and looked at Qin Yu. He braced himself and said, "The rules do not permit it. This is a dead end in itself, one that cannot be walked." Qin Yu waved his hand, interrupting him. "Let me ask you, how can a wisp of the soul of someone who cultivates the myriad soul Tao obtain freedom?" His eyes were sharp. "The freedom I speak of is to become an independent individual, no longer restricted by the main body, and become a pure life form. Think carefully before you speak. Otherwise I will crush you." It was this sentence again. The old turtle's lips twitched, and he nearly cried. Although the myriad soul Tao itself was wrong and impossible to walk, there was no doubt that it was an extremely profound cultivation method. Of course, he was imprisoned in the nightmare ancestral land, enduring loneliness and expending countless efforts to finally create this secret technique. Even if it wasn't complete, its quality was definitely top-notch. After all, the more afraid the old tortoise was of death, the more he would do his best in this matter. He would definitely serve him with all his might. Correspondingly, the myriad-souled Tao's incomparably tyrannical ability. The old tortoise knew better than anyone how he came to be. Of course, he was worried that his shadow would continue to split and copy him. Therefore, there was no way to break the shackles on the split soul. If that wasn't the case, Qizhan wouldn't have sought death for countless years, and it wouldn't have taken him so long to finally achieve his wish. Facing Qin Yu's blazing eyes, the old tortoise paled and sweat dripped down his forehead. But it was impossible for him not to answer. He could clearly feel that beneath Qin Yu's calm exterior, there was a ruthless and cruel mood hidden within. It was like tumbling lava in a volcano, ready to erupt at any moment and burn him to ashes. Whether he was crushed to pieces or burned to ashes, the end result was still death. This matter is very difficult. When I created the Myriad Soul Tao, I was worried that my shadow would betray me. I never thought this would happen. The old tortoise stuttered. His heart was filled with fear, fearing that he would truly reach the end of his life in the next moment. Rumble, rumble, the skies turned dark. Endless black clouds surged outwards. Then billions of bolts of thunder exploded, rampaging through the world. Millions upon millions of lightning snakes wove together, tearing apart the darkness between the heavens and earth. A destructive aura covered the old tortoise, causing him to scream out loud. It's not my fault. It really isn't my fault. When I created the Myriad Soul Tao in the past, I didn't know things would turn out like this. Don't kill me. Please don't kill me. This was Qin Yu's mind world, and he was the ruler of this world. He could change it with a single thought, and everything was within his grasp. If he wanted to kill the old tortoise in front of him, he didn't need to do anything at all. All he needed to do was look at him, and he would be beyond redemption. The time-immortal body could resist the onslaught of time and exist for all eternity, but it had been said countless times before that there were no true absolutes in this world. Even if it existed, it was only limited to a certain range. If he really could become immortal for all eternity, then why would the old tortoise fear death and imprison himself in the nightmare ancestral land, enduring loneliness and not daring to take a single step into the abyss? Of course, this was because the will of the abyss could kill him, and it just so happened that although the little blue lamp's absolute strength couldn't compare with the will of the abyss, in terms of the level of strength, it wasn't any weaker. Thus, it could also accomplish this. In order to survive, the old tortoise could only hand over his source mark. After Qin Yu grasped it, he could destroy it with a single thought. Amidst miserable screams and wails, millions of bolts of lightning constantly illuminated Qin Yu's face. He had already found the source of the Myriad Soul Tao, but he never imagined that the final result would be like this. Unsolvable. It was actually unsolvable. Knowing all of this, Qin Yu certainly thought of Qizhen. He was the shadow of the old tortoise, someone who had sought death for many years without a path to escape. From another angle, this clearly verified everything that the old tortoise had said. The split soul of the Myriad Soul Tao would never be free. Taking a deep breath, Qin Yu looked down at the shivering old tortoise who had curled up into a ball in fear. His tone was icy cold. Even if my main body cultivates the Myriad Soul Tao and cuts off the connection between the two sides, can I still not obtain freedom? The old tortoise really wanted to cry. His body shook like a sieve, and he sullenly shook his head. No, you can't. Once the connection between the two sides is severed, the split soul will vanish. Rumble, rumble. The roar of thunder rose up. Trillions of bolts of lightning tore through the darkness, illuminating Qin Yu's tightly shut eyes and his shivering body. The old tortoise miserably screamed. Faint traces of lightning fell onto his body like long whips, leaving behind countless bloody marks. He rolled back and forth on the ground, not daring to resist at all. He could only passively withstand all of this. Qin Yu had to admit that at this moment, His killing intent had been aroused. He wished he could tear the old tortoise to shreds. But he was well aware that if it weren't for the old tortoise creating the myriad soul Tao, he wouldn't have had the chance to meet Ningling, nor would he have had those memories of being together with her. This was because she shouldn't have appeared in the vast Yang world. It was only because of the existence of the myriad soul Tao that she was able to meet him. Moreover, even if he really killed the old tortoise, so what? Everything had already been decided and nothing could be changed. The skies were still dark and gloomy. The roar of thunder gradually faded away. The old tortoise, who had just escaped death, slumped to the ground and began to cry out loud. He was truly afraid. Just now, the clear and despairing smell of death had wrapped around him. Compared to when he was in the nightmare ancestral land, it was even more terrifying. The old tortoise feared death, but this was the first time he had been so close to death. Then he discovered that death was far more terrifying than he had imagined. Tears and snot flowed down his face. Even though Qin Yu's heart was heavy at this time, his lips still twitched as he looked at the old tortoise. This fellow, to fear death to such a degree, he could be considered a freak of nature. He had entered the abyss to search for a way to unravel the myriad soul Tao. But who would have thought that the final result would be like this? For a time, Qin Yu was at a loss. What should he do next? Should he leave the abyss? His eyes flashed several times. Finally, a sharp light flashed in them. That's right, it was time for him to leave. Return to vast Yang. Return to Ningling's side. He forced himself to calm down. His thoughts raced. Although he couldn't completely rescue Ningling, if he was strong enough to threaten the Peach Blossom Spring Master, then he would naturally be able to force the woman who planted the peach not to take back Ningling's soul fragment. She would still have a long time to live. Taking a step back, this was the only method Qin Yu could think of in his current situation. The bloody scars on the surface of the old tortoise rapidly disappeared. He looked at Qin Yu with fear in his eyes and wiped away his snot and tears. In truth, this isn't necessarily true. There isn't even the slightest possibility. Even though I am the shadow of the abyss, my strength is limited. If I can find someone powerful enough to help me, then perhaps I might be able to forcefully break through the imprisonment of the myriad soul Tao. Qin Yu looked down at him. The old tortoise screamed in fear. It's true, what I said is true. There are no absolutes in this world. The impossibilities that you and I see now are only for the current situation. If one is strong enough, then anything is possible. Qin Yu's eyes brightened. That's right, his mind had been wounded just now, and his emotions were in chaos. So he hadn't thought of this. Although the old tortoise was the creator of the myriad soul Tao, no matter how extraordinary he was only a shadow of the abyss. Facing the myriad soul Tao, the old tortoise was helpless. But what if the will of the abyss personally attacked? That might not necessarily be impossible. As soon as Qin Yu thought of this, he was excited. As long as there was a chance, there was no need to feel despair. Even though he was well aware that asking the will of the abyss to help was nearly impossible, at the very least, this was a ray of hope. As long as Ningling lived and continued to live, sooner or later there would be a day when Qin Yu would be able to move the will of the abyss or an existence on the same level as him. In fact, it might even be possible for him to grow into an existence comparable to the will of the abyss. Time was endless. Who could be sure what the future held? In the past, he was as low as an ant. Because of his old wounds, he had struggled to survive in the fear of death. How could he have imagined that he would have such a day? Seeing Qin Yu's complexion improve and the deathly stillness and coldness in his eyes dissipate, the old tortoise wanted to cry again. Of course, he wasn't afraid. Rather, he was happy. It seemed that he could continue living, today. He didn't want to experience such a scene ever again. After sobbing a few times, the old tortoise wanted to continue showing off his value. Like this, even if there came a day in the future when he accidentally offended Qin Yu again, he could still see that he still had some value, so that Qin Yu wouldn't casually say that he would break him to pieces. Cough, cough, In truth, Master, there is the aura of a formidable existence on your body. Although she isn't strong to the point where she can compare with the will of the abyss, the difference isn't too great. If you can ask her to help, there might be a chance. Qin Yu thought the old tortoise was speaking of the little blue lamp. He shook his head. His current strength isn't enough. In order to control the source mark of the old tortoise, he had learned a little about the existence of the little blue lamp. The old tortoise blinked. I'm not referring to that great lady, but another. He scratched his head. I can't sense it too clearly. That great lady should be a woman. She once sent her strength to your side. Qin Yu immediately realized that the old tortoise was referring to Teacher Liao. That was right. He could still ask Teacher Liao for help. He didn't know how many years it would take for the little blue lamp to restore its strength. But without a doubt, Teacher Liao was an incomparably formidable existence. There was no need to doubt this. For her to be able to send a projection into the abyss and suppress the demon dragon race's elder sublime magic. Just these 2 points were enough to prove her strength. Although he didn't know why Teacher Liao had appeared by his side and why she would help him with everything she had, but since she was willing to help him, that proved that Qin Yu was worth it. It wasn't impossible for him to ask her to help him again. Strictly speaking, he hadn't spent much time with Liao Shi, but the relationship between the two of them was extremely close. Qin Yu was confident he could persuade her. That's right, you're right. I can ask Teacher Liao for help. Qin Yu whispered to himself, excitement on his face. Seeing his words accepted, the old tortoise smiled. Teacher Liao? Is that the name of that formidable existence? Since she was willing to send a projection to your side, she naturally has a close relationship with you. If Master personally comes to ask for help, she will definitely agree. Qin Yu was startled. As he looked at the old tortoise in front of him, he suddenly felt as if he had overlooked something. It was crucial. What was it? Being stared at by Qin Yu, the old tortoise stiffened. Everything was fine just now, so what happened in the blink of an eye? Qin Yu, can you not be so moody? It's so scary. The old tortoise roared inwardly, but he didn't dare to reveal any of his thoughts. He could only brace himself and ask, Master, what is it? Qin Yu took a deep breath, his eyes uncertain. After several breaths of silence, he slowly said, Why aren't you willing to disappear? The syllables were a bit rough. The old tortoise was startled. Was there even a need to ask this? Disappearing meant death, and dying meant the end. My love for the abyss is so deep. So how could I be willing to die like this? He coughed and glanced at Qin Yu. This was normal, so why would he ask such an abnormal question? Master, if I disappear, I will die. Qin Yu waved his hand. You are only a shadow of the abyss. If you disappear and return to the abyss, you will still have your memories. The abyss is you, and you are the abyss. So how can you say you are dead? The old tortoise looked at Qin Yu. He thought that Qin Yu was so fierce, and yet he didn't even know this sort of thing. His level was a bit low. He secretly despised Qin Yu for a moment, and then hurriedly replied, Master, things aren't what you think. How should I say this? Take me as an example. A long time ago, the will of the abyss passed through the skies above a great lake and inadvertently revealed a trace of its aura, thus creating a shadow on the surface of the lake. This is how I was born. After the initial period of ignorance, I awakened my consciousness and stayed in the great lake for many years, until one day I suddenly received an order from the will of the abyss. It seemed to have suddenly sensed the existence of my shadow, and then it didn't want me to continue existing. The old tortoise had an ugly complexion and a gloomy expression. It was clear that even though countless years had passed, the feeling from that time still left him unhappy. I almost died. It was only when I was about to completely disappear that I regained my composure. Why should I obediently disappear? So I ran away. I ran away for many years. And as for what happened afterwards, I'm sure Master already knows. The old tortoise looked at Qin Yu and took a deep breath. I am saying all of this because I want to explain it to Master. If I disappear, I will completely disappear. What you said is correct. My memories still exist, but to the endless years that the will of the abyss has existed for, this is only a moment. It won't be noticed at all, and it is impossible for it to affect my main body in the slightest. Furthermore, the instant I disappear, my own memories will also be erased. It will be as if I had never existed in the first place. So, to me, vanishing is true death. In this world, there will no longer be any trace of me. Chapter 1154. Qin Yu remained silent. In this moment, countless images appeared in his mind. That smug smile, that arrogant smile, that dazed woman who snapped her fingers several times in front of him. No wonder Liao Shi placed the potions she refined in a special bottle and even wrote the name of the number 1 demon refiner in the abyss on it. So she was worried that she would be forgotten and wanted to use this method to leave behind a trace of her existence in the abyss. In the last 10 days, Liao Shi should have already known what would happen to her. It was no wonder she had such a reaction. Qin Yu thought back to the last morning when Liao Shi looked at the weak worms in the puddles of water. Her heart must have been filled with panic and fear. Within his sleeves, Qin Yu clenched his fists and closed his eyes. Liao Shi's figure became increasingly clear in his mind. On the day Liao Shi disappeared, Qin Yu already knew that she was the shadow of some formidable existence, but he didn't understand what the disappearance of a shadow meant. But today he finally understood. He owed her so many favors. He originally thought that he would find a chance to repay her in the future, but now it seemed that he would never have such a chance. Perhaps in the future, Qin Yu would meet a woman who looked exactly like Liao Shi, and she would likely recognize him. But she wasn't Liao Shi, because this name, along with the gradually transparent woman in his arms that day, had disappeared forever. Are you really dead? You know what I mean. So I want you to answer me very seriously. Of course, it's not real. Boy, we will meet again. I'm tired. I'm going to sleep for a bit. Qin Yu turned around. Tears appeared in the corners of his eyes. He took a deep breath, but couldn't suppress the surging emotions in his chest. In truth, he had very complex feelings towards Liao Shi. On one hand, because of her mysterious and unclear origins, he still held a trace of fear towards her. On the other hand, he felt a deep gratitude towards her. The two of them hadn't interacted much. After a period of time, they had hurriedly parted ways. At most, they could only be considered friends. But now, Liao Shi had used her death to ruthlessly cut open a wound in Qin Yu's heart. When she said she was tired and wanted to sleep for a bit, she was saying goodbye to him. To Qin Yu, Liao Shi was only a passerby in his life, a meteor that vanished without a trace. But to Liao Shi, Qin Yu was someone who had existed in her entire life, a witness to her short life. That was why she didn't care about trifles in front of Qin Yu. She was willing to let him take advantage of her and then laugh at his embarrassing appearance. Perhaps this was also her subconscious hope that Qin Yu's impression of her would deepen. In the cave, Liao Shi leaned into Qin Yu's chest on his own initiative. He fell asleep in his arms and vanished. In Liao Shi's heart, Qin Yu was the closest and most trustworthy person in her short life. Perhaps when she was in Qin Yu's arms, when she welcomed the arrival of death, she would feel less fear. The old turtle didn't know what he had said wrong, but it was clear that there was something wrong with Qin Yu's current mood. He was smart enough not to say anything more. He lowered his head and curled his body slightly. He wished he could slap himself in the face. What was he talking about? It has nothing to do with you. Qin Yu's voice was hoarse. He paused for a moment and then continued, Moreover, I should thank you. Thank you for letting me know that I have already lost a very good friend. Shua. Qin Yu's figure vanished from the world of his mind. In the outside world, he opened his eyes and wiped his face. A cold sweat soaked his fingers. It turned out that he was really crying. This sort of expression hadn't appeared on Qin Yu for a very, very long time. Liao Shi, you really are a troublemaker, Chinyu took a deep breath. He revolved his demonic energy, dispelling the tears on his face and his eyes. After a long period of silence, his lips curled up in a bitter smile. He thought that today was truly a sad day. He had received 2 pieces of bad news in a row. Ning Ling could not escape. Liao Shi had died, but this was fate. You never knew what you would receive in the next moment. Would it be the sweetness of candy or the bitterness of gold thread? But no matter what it was, life had to continue. All you could do was accept it and get used to it. But fate could also be changed. But what was needed to change fate was a sufficiently formidable strength. Although Chinyu had become the new king of nightmares and stepped into the peak of the abyss, he was still far from being able to grasp the throat of fate. He lowered his head and looked up again. Chinyu's expression became tranquil once more. He calmly looked out the window at the night sky that was different from that of the vast young world. A thought became increasingly clear in his mind. He really should go back. With the birth of a new nightmare king, the many undercurrents that had gathered rapidly vanished. Everything returned to tranquility. With a king presiding over the nightmare race, their strength had returned to its peak. Unless one was tired of living, no one would be willing to provoke them. According to the traditions of the nightmare race, when a new king was born, a grand coronation ceremony would be held. Guests would be invited from all over, and they would use this opportunity to formally inform all sides. They would also confirm and change the various agreements made during the era of the previous king. Chinyu had no reason to refuse this matter, so he nodded in agreement. But he didn't plan on wasting time. He formally summoned the leaders of the nightmare race, and after making a series of arrangements, he announced that he would go into seclusion. He had entered the abyss because of Liao Shi. Although she had never said it, Chinyu knew this was the case. But Liao Shi was no longer here. If Chinyu wanted to return to the vast young world, he could only rely on himself. This certainly wasn't a simple matter. But the good news was that as the new Nightmare King, Chinyu could easily obtain any information he wanted and look up any ancient texts he was interested in. And most importantly, with the little blue lamp's help, Chinyu had subdued the death-fearing old turtle. As the shadow of the abyss, he knew many things. Of course, even though Chinyu was determined to leave the abyss, the truth was that there were still many matters he needed to deal with before he left. For instance, after he left, what would be done with the Nightmare King throne? Before, he had said that he would return the throne to the bloodline of the previous king. But now that they knew his true identity, the bloodline of the ancient king certainly didn't dare to make such a request. In the end, the abyss and the vast young world were hostile existences, and regardless of whether or not there were hidden secrets, if it weren't for Liao Shi, it would have been impossible for Chinyu to have such thoughts. In the eyes of the life forms of the vast young world, all abyssal life forms should be destroyed. In short, controlling the Nightmare King throne was the best choice. At the very least, he could help the vast young world place a high-level chess piece into the abyss. My name is He Tiangang, and I come from the three-headed Hellhound clan. I am a member of the royal bloodline of the abyss, and I was born with an outstanding bloodline. When I was young, others envied me and complimented me. I once believed that I would become a great figure in the abyss. Indeed, the first half of my life went as smoothly as I imagined. I broke into the Demon Commander realm and my entire family cheered for me. A bright future slowly opened up for me. I once fantasized that I would one day break through the limits of my bloodline and become a true abyssal king. But accidents always came suddenly. I received heavy injuries, and although I managed to maintain my boundary, my bloodline withered away and my path of cultivation was severed. My status plummeted. Because of my arrogance in the first half of my life, my family and I had to pay a heavy price. There were indeed people who kicked me when I was down, but most of them had only themselves to blame. This was something I had to acknowledge. In the end, I left the royal bloodline and entered Giant Deer City. I became the master of Merry Forest and used this as a punishment for myself in exchange for the safety of my family. That was a truly wasted period of time. Every day, I lived in pain and suffering. Perhaps the reason why I named it Merry Forest was because it was what I desired the most in the depths of my heart. But although the name was simple, living a happy life was extremely difficult. It was only on that day that I met Miss Liao Shi and the young master that the gears of my destiny were turned once more. Then I became who I am today. What the miss said was right. The young master inherited a great destiny and will complete the great cause of unifying the abyss. Otherwise, how could it be explained that he had suddenly become the new king of the nightmare race? Fine, to be honest, I had some doubts about Miss Liao Shi's words before. It was just that the miss was strong enough and could give enough benefits, so I chose to tacitly accept it. But now I truly believe it. If anyone dares to doubt the young master, I will be the first to break their head. The young master is the one chosen by the heavens. Becoming the new king of the Nightmare Tribe is just a springboard for him to start the war to unify the abyss, and because of this great cause, he will obtain inconceivable achievements. I, He Tiangang, vow to be loyal to the young master. I will overcome all obstacles for the young master, no matter the cost. His dazed thoughts were suddenly interrupted. The iron-armored guard knelt on the ground and respectfully said, "Lord He Tiangang, the ceremony is about to begin." A sharp light flashed in He Tiangong's eyes. He slowly stood up. He wore the heavy armor of the nightmare demons. The complex patterns on it were not only beautiful, but they also represented a terrifying defensive power. His current status was that of the commander of the guards under the throne, one of the strongest combat forces of the Nightmare Tribe. His status was roughly the same as the previous Marquis, Qianjun. He was below one and above all others. The armor collided with each other, emitting loud crashing sounds. He Tiangang lifted a hand and waved it forward. "Go." With a loud shout, the throne guards rushed out like a flood. They divided into two thick black lines that extended out of the royal hall. The coronation ceremony of the new Nightmare King had officially begun. Walala! With He Tiangang at the lead, countless throne guards knelt on the ground. They shouted out loud like thunder, "We welcome the king's ascension to the throne." Their roars were filled with endless dignity and dignity. They instantly erupted and shot into the skies. The doors to the hall opened. Qinyu, dressed in a wide black royal robe, stepped out. He narrowed his eyes and looked up at the skies. His lips curved in a smile. Then he lowered his head and looked at He Tiangang, who was respectfully kneeling on the ground. He smiled and said, "My most trusted commander of the guards, come with me." He strode forward. He Tiangang looked up. His eyes fell on Qinyu's back. There was a trace of hesitation in his eyes. The young master was indeed the young master. The connection between them couldn't be faked. But for some reason, it gave him a strange feeling. It was a faint sense of alienation. Perhaps it was because the young master was now the new Nightmare King, shaking his head and suppressing this thought. He Tiangang stood up and followed behind. The coronation ceremony went smoothly. Qinyu, who was surrounded by countless abyssal demons, accepted the greetings and congratulations, performed flawlessly in all aspects. Chapter 1155. The Abyss and Vast Young World were certainly connected. If this weren't the case, there wouldn't have been a great calamity that involved the destruction of trillions of lives between the two worlds. But because of that tragic war, the channel between the two worlds had been forcefully sealed. It was condensed from the strength of the world, and not even a true Abyssal King was able to forcefully break it. The current method to enter Vast Young World was to pass through the cracks between the two worlds that hadn't been sealed. But these cracks were far too small and couldn't accommodate a complete abyssal life form. Only by abandoning his mortal body and remaining in a pure soul state could he risk being torn apart and squeezed through the cracks and enter Vast Young World. Qin, you certainly couldn't accept this method. It wasn't just because of the risks, but also because of his mortal body. Although he could seize another body after abandoning it, in the end it wasn't his original body. Moreover, Qin Yu's mortal body was so formidable that he couldn't abandon it. Moreover, things weren't so simple. If it were just Qin Yu alone, then with the strength of the nightmare demon race, they might be able to think of a way. But in truth, the old turtle was also leaving the abyss. The little blue lamp had taken a risk and finally subdued him. It had clearly told Qin Yu that he would rather abandon his mortal body than abandon him. This was because of the time immortal body, and also because of the pure strength of the will of the abyss contained within the old turtle. Whether it was Qin Yu or the little blue lamp, the existence of the old turtle was of paramount importance. They absolutely couldn't afford to lose him. This was the key point. Strictly speaking, the old turtle was a part of the will of the abyss. Taking him away from the abyss was essentially cutting off a piece of flesh from the will of the abyss. This was simply seeking death. This was because it was impossible to conceal this matter from the will of the abyss. The moment he was discovered, all it would need was a single thought to send Qin Yu beyond redemption. Thus, there was only one choice left for Qin Yu. He had to find an incomparably sturdy and large channel that could conceal it from the will of the abyss. At the very least, before he left, he wouldn't be detected. Only then could he smoothly return to the vast young world. With so many restrictions, especially concealing himself from the will of the abyss, the difficulty of returning to the vast young world would increase by more than 100 times. Combining the information he obtained from the nightmare demon race, as well as asking the old turtle, Qin Yu had an approximate idea. But he didn't have absolute confidence it would work. Leaning against a soft and comfortable couch, Qin Yu took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. He rubbed his temples, revealing a bit of weariness. At this time he was sitting quietly in the carriage. His face was pale from lack of blood vitality, and he seemed somewhat weak. "Where are we?" On the other side, Mian replied respectfully, "Young master, I've asked around just now. It will probably take another day before we can enter the next layer of the abyss." "Yes." Qin Yu nodded. He placed his hands behind his head, his eyes piercing through the transparent roof of the car and looking at the gray skies. It seemed that as they went deeper, the light became dimmer and dimmer. Even when it was daybreak, it was the same. Of course, the transparent roof was only for the passengers inside the car. The outside world could not see what was inside. Mianya glanced at the lazy Qin Yu. She thought for a moment and then turned to pour a cup of tea, offering it to him with both hands. "Thank you." Qin Yu received it. As he sipped his tea, he continued to look up at the skies. Sometimes his eyes focused, and sometimes they scattered. It was unknown what he was thinking. Mian Yu was already used to his actions. Seeing that Qin Yu didn't have any other orders, she quietly sat down in a corner. Looking at the skies was a very interesting matter. It was only today that Qin Yu began to understand just what Liao Shi meant when he said he wanted to take a good look at the abyss. It turned out that the so-called experienced and knowledgeable were very reasonable. The more one looked at the abyss, the clearer one would be able to see things and understand some things. As he walked, he looked up at the skies. Apart from sleeping, this was because these days since he left the nightmare demon race were all of Qin Yu's experiences. In a trance, Qin Yu didn't know how long he looked at the skies. Then he put down the empty teacup and helplessly sighed. His current state was far too weak. He had no idea how long it would take for him to recover. Qin Yu closed his eyes and fell asleep once more. His face was still pale as before. Old Fox rode a dragon horse, quietly following behind the carriage. His eyes occasionally swept over the person driving the carriage, subconsciously revealing a look of awe. Then, pride gushed out from the depths of his heart. "My young master is fierce." He was even able to subdue a true abyssal king. In the future, unifying the abyss is certain. In the shadows of the carriage, a pair of eyes peeked out. They saw Old Fox's expression and then revealed a mocking expression. "Old thing, don't be surprised. If you were to see our young master alone threaten two true abyssal kings from the left and the shadow of betrayal from the right, wouldn't your eyes pop out of their sockets?" Suddenly, There was a light knocking sound from within the carriage. Then Mianya's voice sounded out. "Young master has ordered us to rest here today." The carriage stopped. Monarch Schwanza turned his head and looked at the tightly shut carriage. A sharp light flashed in his eyes. As a true abyssal king, his senses were far more sensitive than the demon commander level old fox and shadowless demon. During this time, there was a subtle change in the aura of the carriage that caused him to fall silent. He turned and walked to the side. Without needing any orders, old fox and shadowless demon took the initiative to set up temporary tents. Although the young master rarely ordered them to rest, and they didn't know what the goal of this trip was, since it was the young master's will, all they needed to do was obey. The next day, as the carriage continued on its way, Monarch Schwanza could feel the changes in the aura within the carriage. He sighed inwardly. It was just as he had thought. Chi knew his true identity was likely not just a chess piece of some formidable existence. But thinking about it, this was also normal. After all, ordinary people didn't have the qualifications to be chosen by such a formidable existence. The skies became increasingly dark. Even though it was daytime, it still gave off a gloomy feeling, as if there was an invisible pressure. Moreover, as they hurried along the road, things began to become more difficult. From time to time, they had to stop. This was because more and more brainless demon beasts began to attack this seemingly thin group. This caused the merchant groups that were following them not too far away to break out in cold sweat countless times. But every time, they would be able to avert disaster. It was like there was an invisible monster hidden within this group that cleanly swallowed up all the demon beasts that attacked. Thus, as time passed, although people constantly left, the scale of the merchant groups continued to grow larger and larger. The shrewd and powerful merchants, no matter what background they had or how strong they were, all revealed awe in their eyes as they looked ahead. Without a doubt, this small group was the truly terrifying one. Look, there are more demon beasts attacking. It's a sunless eagle. Look at those black feathers on its body. They can even swallow light. I can't be wrong. Of course I can't be wrong. This long scar on my face was left behind by this beast. In the past, I had a group of over a dozen brothers, but in the end, I was the only one who survived. This isn't an ordinary sunless eagle. Look at its head. Its feathers are slightly raised, forming a faint ring. The color is much darker than the feathers around it. Beast King, it's about to transform. Gulp. It was unknown who gulped, but in this deathly silent environment, it was particularly clear. All they could see were incomparably pale faces. How about we run away? An ordinary sunless eagle was enough to kill off at least half of the people in the merchant group, much less this one that was clearly about to complete its transformation. Although they had personally witnessed powerful magical beasts being slaughtered one after another in front of the team, it was different this time. Could they continue to hold on? Difficult, very difficult. Those that dared to make a living as merchants in the lower regions of the abyss had to be courageous. Otherwise, there was no way they could survive here. But just because they were courageous didn't mean they didn't fear death. If they ran now, they might be able to escape, but if they waited any longer, it would be too late. Cough! Everyone listen to me. A merchant group leader said in a deep voice. In truth, we all know that the merchant group in front tacitly agreed and allowed us to follow behind. They didn't say anything before, but now that something has happened, wouldn't it be disloyal of us to turn around and run? What if they kill off this sunless eagle? What do we do then? If we chase after them, let alone not caring about them, we can't afford to lose face. Of course, these were just words of courtesy. A group of desperate merchants that risked their lives to earn money was simply shameless. But everyone understood the meaning behind these words. They could run now, but after running away, they could forget about coming back to enjoy the treatment of opening the way. Humph, we're about to lose our lives, so why bother talking about face? If anyone wants to stay, then stay. In any case, I'm leaving. The merchant who said that his brothers had been killed by the sunless eagle sneered. The scar on his face became even more hideous as he led his men away without hesitation. He chose to be decisive because he had personally experienced the terror of the sunless eagle, not to mention the one in front of him that was even stronger. The crowd was restless, and soon another 2 merchant groups walked out. Without saying goodbye, they turned around and left, quickly disappearing without a trace. With someone taking the lead, the atmosphere in the merchant group suddenly became uneasy. But in reality, this uneasiness didn't last for long. This was because they suddenly realized that the ruthless aura coming from ahead had suddenly disappeared. They raised their heads abruptly and their eyes widened. The terrifying black shadow in the sky that originally covered the sky had already disappeared. Then there was an earth-shattering sound, as if a mountain had fallen from the sky. Even standing here, they could feel the trembling of the ground. Everyone's stiff and lifeless eyes slowly shifted to the ground. Then the entire merchant group fell into complete silence. This was because there really was a mountain on the ground. That was the corpse of the sunless eagle. A gust of wind blew, and the smell of blood filled the air. As if they didn't know what kind of appalling thing they had done, the group in front paused for a moment and then continued on their way. The silent merchant group came to the side of the mountain-like corpse of the sunless eagle. Looking at its torn chest, everyone's eyes became more and more awed. Such a powerful demon beast was directly killed without the slightest resistance. And the most terrifying thing was that throughout the whole process, they didn't feel the slightest fluctuation of power. 3 days later, the demon wolves roared again and again, madly besieging their chosen prey. Ah, save us, save us. A group of demons looked at the carriage and horse that were quietly coming from afar with ecstasy on their faces. Regardless of the cost, they tore open a gap in the demon wolves' encirclement and rushed towards the carriage with all their might. Monarch Schwanza, who was driving the carriage, slightly raised his head to look. Muffled sounds rang out one after another as heads flew into the sky. The headless corpse continued to rush forward, blood spurting out for a long distance before it fell to the ground with a thud. A wolf howled in horror. A giant white wolf glanced at the carriage from afar and turned to run without hesitation. In the blink of an eye, the entire wolf pack disappeared without a trace. The carriage continued to move forward. The faces of the merchant group turned pale as they looked at the head that was covered with scars not far away. It was the head of the first merchant group to leave the merchant group. They didn't stop, and no one even touched the things on these corpses because they were the spoils of war of the previous team. They didn't need them, but they weren't qualified to occupy them. Chapter 1156. The cold wind was bone-chilling. It carried with it the fishy smell of seawater, filling their noses and mouths. Monarch Schwanza looked into the distance at the endless darkness. A strange light flashed in his eyes before he immediately composed himself. He jumped off the carriage. There was a series of cracking sounds. On the surface of his raincoat, the layer of ice that had condensed over it shattered and fell to the ground. "We've arrived." Monarch Schwanza's voice was calm. After several breaths of time, the carriage door opened and Chinyu smiled and nodded. "I've troubled you along the way." His complexion was still a bit pale, but his eyes were incomparably bright. When he looked at them, they even gave off a dazzling feeling. Monarch Schwanza looked at him without expression. "You've passed through the endless abyss and arrived at the edge of the cold sea. Now, can you tell me your goal?" Chinyu stepped down from the carriage. He glanced at the shivering and pale Mianya and waved his hand, indicating for her to return. Then he said, "I'm sorry, there are some things that this junior still hasn't confirmed, so I really don't know what to say." Of course, this was a lie. Monarch Schwanza frowned, but didn't say anything. Since Chinyu didn't want to say it, there was nothing he could do. Old Fox dismounted from his horse. He walked over and respectfully bowed. "Sir, shall we go in?" Chin Yu looked up at the pitch-black sea in the distance. He smiled and nodded. Of course. The reason we've traveled such a long way is to come here. He took the lead and walked towards the seashore. This city could be called Seaside City, located in the deepest depths of the abyss. The entire city was constructed from a kind of rough black stone that was covered with traces of weathering and corrosion. If one didn't look carefully from afar, it would be hard to distinguish it from the cold sea. The city stood tall in the cold wind, silent like a great beast. Although it seemed quiet, it could actually open its bloody maw at any moment. Fierce, cruel, bloody, these were probably the labels that people subconsciously thought of when they first saw the city. There were people in the city. This wasn't nonsense, but a reminder that those that could survive in this city were absolutely ruthless characters. To them, scars were like hair on their bodies. Everyone in front of them looked at them as if they were knives. Compared to them, Chin Yu, who wore clean and luxurious black robes and calmly walked through the black icicles with an incredibly beautiful maid following behind him, simply looked out of place. Oh, Mayanya had obediently returned to the carriage, wrapped herself up in a thick layer of clothing, and walked down again. Although she was bloated, just her small face and watery eyes were enough to attract the attention of others. Almost all the eyes of the demon clan men in front of her fell on her body. They stuck out their tongues and licked the corners of their lips, their eyes filled with passion and greed. There were a few exceptions. Their gazes fell on Chin Yu. Compared to Mayanya, their gazes weren't any worse. Of course, this was just an example, so there was no need to elaborate on this aspect. Black City was really too cold, so cold that it was impossible for those delicate women to survive, and women who were qualified to live were often more terrifying than men. So in this damned place, women were in high demand and also the most profitable business for those caravans that risked their lives. After an ordinary female slave entered Black City, they could earn over 100 times the profit. Unfortunately, these female slaves didn't live long. They could only rely on the caravans to sell them in batches. And Mayanya, no matter how one looked at it, couldn't be compared to those female slaves. But no one spoke and no one approached to do anything, even though the burning gazes of those fierce demon clan men nearly melted her. They watched as Chin Yu and his group quietly entered Black City, finally vanishing from sight. They stopped outside the city in a caravan group, rubbing their hands together as they breathed out cold air. They spat out a mouthful of saliva in disappointment, but it instantly froze and fell to the ground. A bunch of cowards. They were fierce to us, but now they don't even have the guts. Cowards! They fiercely cursed, but they couldn't help but admit that these bastards were smart enough to not cause any trouble. They originally thought that these villains would suffer a bit so that they would be a bit more restrained in the following transactions. A caravan leader bitterly smiled. Those that can survive in Black City definitely aren't stupid. Haven't we all guessed it already? He turned and looked at his subordinates, following close behind him, a fervent look in his eyes. Everyone, it's time for us to enter the city. Let's go. There are many people that came this time. So let's say in advance that everything will be according to the previous agreement. No one can violate the rules. That's right, we borrowed the light of others to smoothly arrive at Black City. We can't waste it. We have to earn a great deal of good luck this time. The arrival of a caravan far larger than usual injected a brief liveliness into the cold and lonely Black City. The entire city came alive with it. Bright lanterns were lit up everywhere in the city. Every place where the lanterns were lit represented the station of a caravan. They had all sorts of materials that were scarce in Black City. As long as one could afford it, they could obtain everything they wanted. As for female slaves, they were the most expensive of them all. Mian stood in front of a window, not too far away. Her eyes fell on a low courtyard that was brightly lit. Even though she was far away, she could still hear the horrifying laughter and the pitiful screams of women. She crossed her arms, her body shivering. She subconsciously turned to look at Chin Yu, who was calmly drinking tea at a table. Only then did she calm down a little. Close the window, the wind is too strong. Qin Yu lightly said, his expression calm. Every place had its own rules, and everyone had their own destiny. It was impossible for everyone to interfere. Even if they weren't afraid of trouble, they would still tire themselves to death. Mianya closed the window and walked back. She poured a cup for Qin Yu. In this cold environment, the steam from the cup was particularly clear. Even the best in Black City and the best room couldn't completely isolate the cold from the outside world. This cold came from the cold sea outside the city. It was also the city's most terrifying killer. Over the countless years, it had swallowed countless lives. For instance, the screams of the female slaves were likely to end up like this. Mianya rubbed her stiff fingers together. It was unknown what she was thinking, but a bit of worry crossed her face. Qin Yu said, "There is no need to worry. You should know that I won't let anything happen to you." He lifted a hand and pointed at the bed. In this icy cold room, this was the only place that emitted warmth. It was also the greatest manifestation of this extremely expensive room's value. After all, to maintain such a warm bed in Black City, even if it wasn't too large, the costs were still astoundingly great. Go and sleep. You've worked hard on this trip. Mianya obediently nodded. She took off her thick outer clothes, revealing her alluring figure. She drilled into the bed, only her head poking out. She looked at Qin Yu and hesitated for a moment. Then she said, "Sir, your body hasn't fully recovered yet. How about we rest on the bed together?" Qin Yu waved his hand. "No need." Without further explanation, Mianya's eyes revealed a trace of disappointment. The room fell silent, holding the teacup. Qin Yu could feel the warmth rapidly dissipating between his fingers. He tapped his fingers. Old Fox should have found the person. Where there was a sea, there would naturally be a pier. Black City was no exception. Or it would be more accurate to say that the fundamental reason for the existence of this city was this pier. Black City existed because of the cold sea, and the pier was the only place where one could enter and leave the cold sea. Old Fox was here, and the shadowless demon was hidden in the shadows beneath his feet. The two of them possessed strength that far surpassed anything Shiri could compare with. But as they stood in the bone-chilling cold of the pier, they still felt extremely cold. "My family, sir, wishes to go out to sea. May I ask if there are any large ships that are planning to set sail?" Old Fox smiled and cupped his hands together, his expression harmless. But this appearance of his didn't cause the other party to look at him warmly. Instead, the other party's icy cold eyes wandered back and forth over him. "What is your goal in going out to sea?" Old Fox honestly said, "How could servants like us possibly know the master's will? If you don't say it, then you won't be able to board the ship." The man across from him bared his pitch-black chest. Even though the temperature was terrifyingly low, it didn't seem to harm him at all. On the contrary, it was like a raging flame was burning within his body, causing the crisscrossing scars on his body to burn red and exude a thick, killing intent. His cold eyes stared at Old Fox like a man-eating wolf. Old Fox frowned. "Is there no other way?" The bare-chested man frowned slightly, and the chill in the air suddenly became even heavier. At this time, a woman walked over and whispered something into his ear. The man's eyebrows furrowed even tighter. The woman stood up and drew back. Old Fox subconsciously glanced at her. This was the first woman he had seen since entering Black City. Her skin was rough and dark. This was the work of the sea breeze and the cold. But she was unexpectedly beautiful. In addition to her strong and healthy body and icy cold eyes, she gave off a wild sense of beauty. If this were any other place, this woman would have been able to arouse the desire of many men to conquer her. But this was Black City by the cold sea. The moment Old Fox's eyes fell on her, the woman seemed to sense it. She turned her head, and their eyes met. Old Fox's body stiffened, but he revealed a smile. The woman turned and left. Old Fox sighed inwardly. He thought that this place was far too dangerous. He didn't think he was weak, but with just a glance, he actually felt an intense threat from this woman. In terms of strength, he was definitely stronger. But if it was a life or death battle, he would be the one to die. You can leave. Let your young master think clearly about his purpose in entering the cold sea, and then come find me. The man turned and left. He paused for a moment and then turned back. My name is Tang Hai. Old Fox wanted to say something, but he shut up the next moment. After cupping his hands, he turned and left. Only when he left the pier did he let out a long breath. His face paled and there was a hint of shock in his eyes. What a terrifying aura! That Tang Hai was definitely one of the top powerhouses in Black City. The feeling he gave Old Fox was that even Hei Tiangang was weaker than him. Shadowless Demon's gloomy voice came from the shadow. If we can't complete young master's request, what should we do? Old Fox bitterly smiled. We can only go back and tell the truth. It is a bit shameful, but young master should be able to understand. It is better than us being killed. Just now, he really felt a thick, killing intent that was almost condensed into a substance. It was as if he said one more word, he would be met with a horrifying attack. Because of this, he left the pier in a hurry without saying a word. Shadowless Demon sighed. We can only do this. The two of them returned without accomplishing anything. They stood awkwardly in front of him. Qin Yu rubbed his chin and smiled. It's fine. As long as you show your faces and pass on the message, it's fine. After a pause, a sharp light flashed in his eyes. They followed behind us all the way and saved many people from dying. It's about time they did something. Chapter 1157. The people sitting in this room were undoubtedly the most popular ones in Black Castle. As the leaders of the various caravans, they naturally had this kind of status before the goods in their hands were completely exchanged. For the time being, they temporarily put aside the transactions that could bring in huge profits every minute because they weren't worried about the sales of their goods. Of course, the most important thing was that the person they were about to discuss had the qualifications to make them sacrifice for him. Everyone is here. Everyone's time is precious, so I won't be long-winded and will get straight to the point. The person in charge of this gathering glanced around. Young Master Qin's people went to the docks and were rejected by Tang Hai. I think we should do something. As soon as his voice fell, another caravan leader smiled bitterly. Tang Hai is one of the hardest bones to bite in Black Castle. Even if we speak, we might not be able to please him. That's right, Tang Hai is not easy to deal with. Unless young Master Qin gives a clear answer, it will be very difficult to change his decision. He groaned incessantly. The host of the gathering sneered. Don't talk nonsense. Since you're here today, you should already know why. His pupils constricted, revealing a look of fear. Don't forget what happened to Scarface and the others. The room instantly fell silent. The caravan leaders all had grave expressions on their faces. This was indeed something they had no choice but to consider. Strictly speaking, the reason they were able to safely arrive at Black City was because they had taken advantage of Qin Yu's group. Now that he was a coward, who knew if he would flip out? No one was willing to bear the consequences of young Master Qin losing his temper. The speaker of the gathering saw that everyone recognized the seriousness of the matter, and his tone softened a little. Returning a favor and helping young Master Qin achieve his wish is what we should do. You and I almost didn't lose anything on this trip to Black City, and the profit we can earn is at least several times higher than expected. No matter how tough Tang Hai is, he isn't alone. He has so many subordinates under him. We have to think about them. Sai, that's the only way. If no one has any objections, let's discuss the rules. Hee. I'll just take it as an advance investment. Perhaps because of this, I'll be able to leave a good impression in front of young Master Qin. Who knows, there might even be other gains. His words made everyone's eyes light up. The discussion that followed was rather smooth. At most, it was about the convenience of the loss of benefits. After a few more arguments, it was settled. On this day, the 3 elected leaders of the caravan entered the dock outside Black City. As for the specifics of what was said, only Tung Hai and the 3 caravans knew. Soon, a woman arrived at the inn where Qin Yu and the others were staying. The first leader has agreed for you to board the ship. We will weigh anchor in 3 days. Don't miss the time. Cold was about to leave when her gaze landed on Mianya. There was a hint of hesitation in her gaze. Qin Yu glanced at Mianya. Mianya walked forward and smiled. What's the matter, big sister? If you need any help, just let me know. You guys talk. Qin Yu turned around and left. An hour later, the woman from the pier left the inn. Compared to when she arrived, her complexion was much more relaxed. She glanced at Qin Yu, who was sitting in the cold living room, quietly drinking tea. She thought for a moment and said, "When we enter the frigid sea this time, the boss has received some business. We might have to go much deeper, so you should all prepare ahead of time." She didn't stay any longer. She turned and left. As for Tung Hai entering the frigid sea ahead of time, it wasn't a secret to begin with. The woman didn't worry that Qin Yu and the others would have any crooked thoughts. Otherwise, humph, that would be the same as seeking their own death. Go deep into the frigid sea? Qin Yu revealed a smile. That couldn't be any better. He was originally thinking about how to make the ship sail for several more days. After the woman left, everyone in the caravan sent an invitation to Qin Yu, inviting him to attend a banquet and so on. Without surprise, the invitation was rejected by Qin Yu. But everyone in the caravan had already expected this, so they didn't care at all. They had already expressed their attitude in front of Sir Qin. That was enough. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. At the dock outside Black City, a large ship quietly floated on the sea. There was no need to describe it. Just the word large was enough to show its essence. It was truly large, like a small island. At the bow and stern of the ship, there were thick and sharp horns that were twisted and broken. The surface of the ship was a deep and dark reddish-brown color. Just looking at it made one feel a chill run down their spine. Tung Hai stood on the deck. He looked at Qin Yu, paused for a moment, and then shifted his gaze to Monarch Xuanzi, who was silently standing behind him. After several breaths of time, his pupils shrank. He looked at Qin Yu several more times, lifted an arm, and shouted out, "Board the ship!" The ship was large, not only because the winds and waves of the frigid sea were greater, but also because there were far too many people that needed to board the ship. Although there was a dock outside of Black City, the truth was that there weren't many ships that sailed throughout the year. To the desperados of Black City, this was a grand event that they couldn't miss. They endured the bitter cold and lived in this place. Of course, this wasn't because they had masochistic tendencies. The frigid sea was terrifying. But to these desperados, it also contained endless possibilities. Qin Yu led the way. Mianya stuck close to him. The burning hot and greedy eyes all around her caused her face to pale. Monarch Xuanzi fell behind the two of them. Old Fox waved his hand. "Young master, be careful." He had been asked to stay in Black City. Although he didn't know why he stayed in Black City, Old Fox didn't question him. It was just that in his mind he subconsciously thought back to the iron box that the young master had given him. It had completely sealed away all auras. Old Fox didn't know what was inside, but he could feel a dignified look in the young master's eyes. This was probably the reason he stayed in Black City. As long as he lived, he absolutely wouldn't let anyone touch this iron box. Shadowless Demon was still hidden in Old Fox's shadow. He watched Qin Yu's group board the ship, a bit of depression in his eyes. That little girl Mianya, why was she able to follow the young master? The one who should be boarding the ship the most should be him. After all, on this ship where the situation was complex and unclear, he was an expert at hiding his aura and scouting for information. He was indispensable. But Qin Yu clearly didn't explain anything. He only told him to listen to Old Fox's arrangements. This left Shadowless Demon even more depressed. He looked at Monarch Xuanzi's back with a bit of bitterness in his eyes. If it weren't for this old ghost, he wouldn't have missed the chance to get closer to the young master. He wouldn't have been robbed by Old Fox and Haetiangang, and he would have fallen to his current unvalued status. As Monarch Schwanza boarded the ship, his lips twitched. He thought that the people around Chinyu were too insolent. Did they really think that he, a dignified, true king, couldn't sense anything? Humph, humph, especially Shadowless Demon. If it weren't for you, a dignified, true king like me wouldn't have fallen into the hands of others. I'll give you one more point. When I have a chance in the future, I'll carefully settle this with you. Monarch Schwanza sneered inwardly. He looked up at Tun Hai, who was standing at the bow of the ship. Their eyes met for a moment before he lowered his head. Although the surrounding men looked at Mianya as if they wanted to skin her alive, no one dared to approach. This group of people in front of him had entered Black City without any accidents. This was a demonstration of their strength. Not to mention, there was some news from the merchant group that made the desperados of Black City secretly afraid. Desperados were people who didn't fear death for the sake of their own benefits. But it was just a woman. No matter how thirsty they were, they wouldn't throw their lives away for her. The woman who delivered the letter to the inn was also the only woman in the group of villains under Tung Hai. She came in front of Chinyu and looked at the pale Mianya. She couldn't help but frown, and her expression towards Chinyu became even colder. "Follow me." As she spoke, she grabbed Mianya and walked forward first. From all directions, the heated gazes that gathered on them quickly disappeared. No one dared to reveal any other emotions. The woman sneered and said to Mianya, "Men are cheap. If you beat them up, they won't dare to have any other thoughts." Mianya was embarrassed. Chinyu rubbed his nose. He looked at the woman's strong back and thought that her words were a bit innuendo. As if sensing Chinyu's gaze, the woman turned around and coldly looked at him. If a man can't even protect his own woman, then he might as well kill himself. Her words were very extreme. It made one feel like there was some hidden story behind them. Humph! The woman turned her head and coldly led the way. Chinyu helplessly smiled and waved his hand at Mianya, indicating that it was fine. It was most likely because of Mianya that Chinyu's group of 3 had very good accommodations arranged on the ship. The view was good, and they didn't feel stuffy. Of course, there was still the cold. There were at least several thousand desperados on the ship. How could there be enough supplies to keep warm? If he couldn't even withstand this chill, then so be it. In any case, it was only a matter of time before he died. Set sail. At the bow and stern of the ship, thick and rusty chains began to move. With a loud crashing sound, a giant anchor was pulled out from the sea. A low and deep hum came from within the ship. Chinyu's eyes flashed, because at this moment he seemed to hear a low roar. This ship, could it be that it was alive? He glanced at Monarch Schwanji. This old fellow was expressionless and didn't reveal any strange emotions. It was impossible to guess what he was thinking. Walala! The ship broke through the waves. In the pitch-black seawater, it drew a white line as it slowly sailed into the depths of the endless cold sea. Woo, woo, woo! The low and deep sound of a horn echoed out from Black City. This was a necessary step every time a ship set sail. It was a prayer to the cold sea, praying that it would be merciful and not cause too much slaughter. But death was inevitable. This was the price and punishment that the demons had to bear for entering the cold sea. Black City was cold, but the cold sea was even colder. As the ship sailed across the sea, it naturally displayed this chill to the fullest. From the moment Mianya boarded the ship, she had burrowed into her blankets. Even though only her head was exposed, she was still shivering from the cold. Her teeth constantly chattered. In the narrow cabin, they emitted small ka-ka-ka sounds. This was a bit shameful. A faint blush appeared on Mianya's pale face, but this wasn't something she could control. Chinyu looked away from the sea and the sky and turned to look at her. Although her cultivation wasn't weak, the cold of the cold sea was far too terrifying. Moreover, They hadn't even entered the depths of the cold sea yet. If this continued, Mian-yu wouldn't be able to withstand it. Chin-yu looked at the door and hesitated. Mian-yu guessed his thoughts and shook her head. Sir, I'm not cold. There's no need to trouble Senior. She wasn't too clear on Monarch Xuanji's identity. No one explained it to her, and she was smart enough not to ask. But this didn't mean that Mian-yu didn't know just how strong and terrifying Monarch Xuanji was. In front of Monarch Xuanji, even someone as strong as Ebony Sky, Old Fox, and Shadowless Demon were as obedient as little kittens, always respectful. She certainly didn't dare to approach. Chin-yu sighed inwardly. He walked over to the bed and sat down. Stay closer to me. He looked up and continued to look outside the window. The sky and sea were overcast, almost turning black. His mind was immersed in this scene, and he suddenly lost track of time. After an unknown period of time, Chin-yu suddenly became aware of something. He looked down at Mian-yu, who was tightly hugging him, nearly burrowing into his chest. Chin-yu's lips twitched. He shook his head and closed his eyes. During this long journey, he had nearly recovered from the weakness in his body, but he still felt that he lacked energy. Chin-yu had already experienced this before. An appropriate amount of rest was much more efficient than stubbornly persisting. On the second day after the ship entered the cold sea, the chill rose once more. The first wave of attacks from the sea finally erupted. It was a bonefish with pitch-black scales all over its body. The reason why it was called a bonefish was because its body was covered with a layer of white bone armor. Its entire body was extremely thin and withered, as if its head was really made up of these pale white bones. The bonefishes constantly tore through the sea surface and leapt into the air. Their speed was astonishing. They were like sharp arrows that pierced through the air, stabbing towards everyone. Some unlucky fellows had their bodies torn apart. They cried out miserably as they fell into the sea. Blood flashed as they were eaten up in the blink of an eye. Of course, even more bonefishes were killed. The eyes of the desperados shined. They didn't care about the wounds on their bodies at all. After crushing the bonefishes, they placed them into their storage treasures. Some of the more impatient ones immediately stuffed the bonefishes into their mouths, chewing on them with loud crunching sounds. Traces of blood splashed out as they laughed happily. The bonefish's attacks continued for a full hour. After crossing an invisible line, they seemed to have exceeded their hunting range. After several breaths of time, they vanished from sight. The desperados fell to the ground one after another, gasping for breath. But their faces were filled with excitement. Since they hadn't died, they had profited greatly. This was certainly something to be happy about. Some people began to clean up the battlefield and repair the small marks that appeared on the surface of the ship. In the cold sea, this ship was everyone's hope of survival. Now, a small crack might lead to an incomparably terrifying ending. They absolutely couldn't afford to be careless. After the battle, the casualties of the desperados numbered around 100. This wasn't a high ratio. Tung Hai relaxed a little. Although they had gone out to sea ahead of schedule, the cold sea's performance was still normal. There weren't too many changes. He swept his eyes around. In a quiet cabin, when everyone rushed out to hunt the bonefishes, that cabin had remained quiet from start to finish. Tung Hai subconsciously furrowed his eyebrows. This was because he knew that this silence only meant that they had an even greater goal. Just why did they come here? If there were subordinates familiar with Tung Hai here, they would discover that the great boss's eyes weren't as simple as they seemed. The skies became darker, causing the seawater to become even darker. Of course, the relationship between the two sides could also be reversed. Mian-yu had already adapted to hugging Chin-yu for warmth. She didn't blush so often, but rather seemed to enjoy it. Of course, the truth was that she had to maintain a state of being close to Chin-yu at all times. Otherwise, the terrifying cold outside would soon turn her into a giant block of ice. This was because it had already been 7 days since the great ship went out to sea. From here, they could be considered to have truly entered the depths of the cold sea. Chapter 1158. Entering the depths of the cold sea meant that the true dangers had just begun to arrive. The first wave came from a giant, deep-sea octopus. Its entire body was deep blue, like a beautiful and dazzling ice crystal. But while it was beautiful, it also represented absolute terror. Its tentacles were over 100,000 feet long, and they tightly wrapped around the ship. One could clearly hear the ship groaning in their ears. The suckers at the bottom of the tentacles erupted with a terrifying swallowing strength. Even though the desperados on the ship were fierce, in front of it they were as fragile as an egg with its shell peeled off, leaving behind only a thin layer of translucent membrane. Qin Yu personally witnessed a Black City desperado being sucked in by the suckers. In the blink of an eye, his entire body withered away. His flesh and blood, mixed with his bones, were cleanly swallowed, leaving behind only a thin layer of paper-thin skin that floated down to the ground. This battle lasted for an entire day and night. After the deep-sea octopus ate and drank its fill, it finally let go of the damaged ship and vanished into the pitch-black deep sea. The sky was black, and the sea was also black. Only the lights on the ship released a bleak light. After this battle, the atmosphere on the ship began to change. Some people thought that they had sailed far enough and it was time to go back. But this proposal was directly rejected by Tung Hai. The reason was that he hadn't finished his business yet. This reason was sufficient. Of course, the most important reason was that Tung Hai was a member of the ship and he was strong enough. So after a short period of repairs, the ship continued to sail deep into the sea. And at this time there were less than 3,000 desperados that boarded the ship from Black City. Around a quarter of them had died. First leader, the deep-sea blue seal, should not have appeared here. I'm afraid we encountered some changes in the sea by heading out early this time. In the ship's hold, those who had the qualifications to sit were all people with status on the ship. Including Tung Hai, there were only 6 people. One of them was that woman who didn't like Qin Yu. Hearing this, everyone frowned. A trace of fear appeared in the depths of their cold eyes. No one knew why the sea changed, but every time it appeared, it was when the cold sea was at its most terrifying. This was because the rules that the people of Black City had used countless lives to figure out were no longer effective. Moreover, some terrifying life forms hidden in the depths of the cold sea would appear on the surface and attack them. This was the most fatal factor of danger. For example, this deep-sea blue octopus. They weren't the only ones with knowledge. Sea transformation wasn't a secret in Black City. That was why there were voices asking to stop and return to Black City in advance. The wild woman had an even wilder name, Mountain Cat. Her eyes were cold. We can still suppress the current situation, but if there are more accidents, it will be very troublesome. Voices within a small area could be suppressed, but once it went out of control, even if they were the masters of the ship, they would have to obey the will of the majority. Otherwise, did they really think that the desperados in Black City wouldn't do things like killing people and seizing ships? Similar things had happened before. Of course, no one dared to have this idea easily. Those who could control a large ship and had the qualifications to go out to sea were the top characters in Black City. Even if such a character could be killed, it would require countless lives to be forcefully piled up. As mentioned before, desperados were also afraid of death. Not to mention, if Tung Hai and the others died, the ship would be mostly destroyed. Did he really think that he didn't have any countermeasures or trump cards? But for things like accidents, if there was a first, there would often be a second. Qin Yu stood in front of the cabin window. He looked at the giant beast blocking the way and frowned. There's going to be trouble. Mianya leaned against him, her body shivering in fear. Even though they were far away, the aura of the giant beast still caused a powerful suppression on her. This was a suppression on the level of bloodline. This was the first time Qin Yu saw the might of the ship. So it wasn't just a tool for navigating the cold sea, but also a powerful moving fortress. The bow and stern of the ship were terrifying killing machines. Every time they collided with the giant beast, large wounds would be torn open on its body, and blood would splash out. Of course, the so-called large wounds were only seen from the perspective of the abyssal demons. In truth, this giant beast was astonishingly large, and its wounds weren't small. But they weren't serious injuries either. 2 days later, the ship escaped the attack of this unknown giant beast and returned to tranquility once more. The black seawater was like a huge mirror. Strangely, there were no ripples at all. The ship stopped on the sea. It had been severely damaged and had no choice but to stop and repair itself. As for the desperados on the ship, there were only around 2,000 of them left. Several hundred people had died in the battle with the giant beast in these 2 days. Those that survived certainly had harvests. The blood that the giant beast threw out, the scales and flesh that fell off, were all precious treasures to them. But no matter how tempting these harvests were, they needed to be alive in order to have any meaning. Otherwise, everything they obtained now would be equal to nothing. The atmosphere on the ship became oppressive. The voices against continuing to sail became increasingly intense. Nearly half of the desperados requested to return. Although it hadn't been made clear yet, news of the sea transformation had already begun to spread in private, causing fear to appear on the faces of countless people. A meeting was held in the cabin once more, but this time there were only 5 people attending. Those that were absent had fallen into the cold sea during the battle, and no one could save them. They could only watch helplessly as they sank to the seabed. The atmosphere became even more oppressive. A business that could move Tung Hai's heart and disrupt his previous plans to sail ahead of time was certainly a massive business. The profits after this were enough for them to enjoy for several years. Thus, everyone unanimously agreed to enter the cold sea ahead of time. But the sea transformation really happened. Tung Hai could feel the change in the mentality of his subordinates. He could understand it, so he didn't say much. He glanced at them and said lightly, "Wait a moment." After he finished speaking, he stood up and left the cabin. He stood behind the railing. The view here was very good, and he could see the entire situation on the ship. Of course, with such a good view, it also meant that all eyes from all directions could smoothly fall on him. Tung Hai could feel the anxiety and uneasiness in their eyes, which concealed a trace of bloodthirst, but his expression remained calm. To be able to become the owner of a ship, the storms he had experienced in his life were enough to help him temper an incomparably strong will. Moreover, at this moment, his attention did not fall on these gazes that were gathered from all directions. Tung Hai had always been looking in the same direction, but to his disappointment, he didn't get any response. If that's the case, Tung Hai took a deep breath, turned around, and entered the cabin. He said expressionlessly, "Continue sailing." In the cabin, the expressions of the 4 people, including Lynx, changed slightly, but they didn't say anything. This was the prestige that Tung Hai had built up over the years with his strength and facts. After the repairs were completed, the ship continued to move forward. The first wave of opposition appeared, but it was quickly suppressed. The method was very cruel. Anyone who tried to cause trouble was directly beheaded, and blood dyed the deck red. The clamoring to return to the ship disappeared. But Tung Hai and the others knew that the real danger was often in silence. Reality proved that their consciousness was not wrong. On the incomparably dark ship, there was a wave of riots. Tung Hai survived, but one of his most trusted subordinates was personally beheaded by him. Therefore, in the cabin, there were only 4 people who participated in the meeting. Tung Hai's eyes were cold. "Continue to move forward. If anyone objects, you can continue to try to kill me." Lynx found him, but he didn't give any explanation. Even though she was the only woman by his side, Tung Hai's attitude towards her was not excessive at all. The black sky, the black sea, and the scarred ship moved forward in loneliness. The extremely cold aura gradually covered the surface of the ship with a thick layer of ice, which was as black as the sea. It covered everything. So, those who lived on the ship were also living on the ice. But what people couldn't understand was, with such extreme cold. Why hadn't the cold sea below frozen over? Maianya had fallen unconscious. Even with Qin Yu's warmth, it wasn't enough to help her completely avoid the invasion of the cold. Luckily, there was still King Xuanzi. The strength of a true abyssal king wasn't just for show. The terrifyingly low temperature of the cold sea didn't seem to affect him at all. It was unknown what fruit he fed Maianya, but it was bright red all over. After eating it, Maianya fell into a deep slumber, and her pale face began to flush with blood. This fruit can temporarily help her resist the invasion of the cold, but it can only last for 3 days. King Xuanzi glanced at Qin Yu. Although I still have some with me, the deeper we go into the cold sea, the stronger the cold will become, and the weaker the fruit's effects will be. This was a reminder to Qin Yu that if he continued, there was a chance she would die. Qin Yu nodded. He suddenly said, "Senior seems to be very familiar with the cold sea?" King Xuanzi lightly said, "The true abyssal king is impervious to all evil. This is an ability bestowed upon them by the will of the abyss. You will understand in the future." To put it more bluntly, if one didn't understand the abilities of a true abyssal king, then one shouldn't speak nonsense. This old thing, no matter how calm he appeared on the surface, his heart was already filled with impatience. And this impatience proved that Qin Yu's words just now seemed to have touched upon something. Could it be that the Netherworld king bloodline that had disappeared into the abyss and disappeared without a trace was actually hidden in the cold sea? King Xuanzi didn't speak, but he felt that Qin Yu's eyes were incomparably loathsome. This brat's nose was quite sharp. In all fairness, he hadn't exposed anything, but Qin Yu had still managed to discover a flaw. This caused him to feel a bit of regret. He hadn't carefully considered the fruit he fed Maianya. He should have just watched her freeze to death. That's right. Qin Yu's guess was correct. The Netherworld king bloodline was hidden in the deepest part of the abyss, the extremely terrifying cold sea. This was because only this place could barely suppress the uncontrollable power of fire within the Netherworld king bloodline's inherited bloodline. Qin Yu glanced at King Xuanzi's ugly complexion. He smiled and said, "If so, then what Tung Hai saw last time was senior." He rubbed his chin. With the strength of the Netherworld king bloodline, it should be easy to control several ships that enter and leave the cold sea. "Senior, don't you think so?" King Xuanzi was expressionless. He glanced at Qin Yu and then turned to walk away. He sat back down in a corner and closed his eyes. However, his attitude in itself indicated a great deal. A sharp light flashed in Qin Yu's eyes. The corners of his lips curved up in a smile before he immediately composed himself. He didn't fear the Netherworld king bloodline, even if its strength was terrifying, because King Xuanzi himself was his protective shield. This old fellow definitely didn't want something as shameful as him to be discovered. Thus, the one who didn't want to encounter them was actually King Xuanzi. However, this old fellow's plans were likely to fail. Qin Yu turned to look at Maianya and then at the ship that was covered in black ice. He let out a light breath. He had underestimated the strength of the cold sea. If it weren't for the Netherworld king bloodline being here, things would have been much more troublesome. "Senior, I'll have to trouble you to contact your family." King Xuanzi opened his eyes. As he looked at the smiling Qin Yu, he wished he could punch him and smash him to smithereens. Chapter 1159. Tung Hai panicked. As mentioned before, desperados were afraid of death. Even their leader, Shi Xingshan, was no exception. Of course, he knew that he was walking on a tightened steel wire. Even if he was skilled and wouldn't fall, what if the steel wire broke? What awaited him was no different. He would be crushed into pieces. Now, Tung Hai slept with one eye open. He didn't even eat or drink. As long as he could persist, he would hold his breath. There was no other way. He didn't know who wanted to kill him, and he didn't know what methods they would use. No one could be trusted. Even Lynx, who climbed into his bed, was alienated and guarded against. Because the more one experienced the tempering of life and death, the more one understood that nothing was impossible under the shadow of the great terror of life and death. If he had a choice, Teng Hai would have ordered the ship to return. Didn't he know how terrifying the sea was? So what if it was a big business? Without his life, no matter how much he paid, it was meaningless. But he couldn't, because King Xuanzi was on the ship. When they boarded the ship, Teng Hai was able to determine his identity. However, King Xuanzi didn't reveal his identity, so he could only remain silent. On the surface, everyone thought that he was the person with the highest authority on the ship. But in fact, with the appearance of King Xuanzi, he had become a puppet. Without King Xuanzi's order, he didn't dare to announce the return. Creak! The cabin door was pushed open. Layers of ice rubbed against each other, emitting harsh sounds. Mountain Cat walked in with a slightly pale face. Even she couldn't withstand the chill in this place. Therefore, she was aware of the living conditions of the others on the ship. If they continued to move deeper into the cold sea, everyone would die here. Since death was inevitable, they wouldn't choose such a humiliating death. The volcano could erupt at any moment. Even if Teng Hai was the strongest person on the ship, he would still be burned to ashes. Teng Hai, no matter what you think, we must return unless you want to drag everyone down with you. Teng Hai looked at her, his eyes cold. You don't understand. I don't understand, but this isn't your style. If there is something, you can tell me. Perhaps I can help you. Lynx stared into his eyes. Teng Hai remained expressionless as he replied, No. His voice stopped abruptly. He abruptly got up and quickly walked out of the cabin to the observation deck. He gripped the railing tightly with both hands, and with a cracking sound, the layer of ice was crushed and fell. Mountain Cat quickly caught up. What's the matter? Teng Hai took a deep breath and withdrew his gaze. Give the order. Change the course and head towards the north-southeast. After some hesitation, he glanced at Mountain Cat and said in a gentler tone, Get ready, we're about to return. Finally, King Xuanzi's order came. The atmosphere on the ship eased slightly. Everyone knew that Teng Hai had decided to return. Although many people had died, they were still alive, and every one of them had obtained a harvest that far exceeded their expectations. After all, danger and reward in the frigid sea had always been proportional. In fact, it was precisely because of this that the desperados from Black City could endure until now. After all, the way of thinking of a person with bare feet and a person with shoes would always be somewhat different. Seeing the ship change direction, King Xuanzi's complexion darkened even more. He glared at Qin Yu. Next, I hope that you can remain quiet. Qin Yu understood his meaning. He smiled and said, Of course, this junior absolutely won't make things difficult for you. King Xuanzi nearly exploded with anger. You still dare to say you won't make things difficult for me? What the hell are you laughing at? You bastard, why don't you just die? But regardless of whether King Xuanzi was willing or not, after a day passed, it was finally time to meet again. A second ship appeared in the Black Sea. The bow of the ship was lit with red lanterns, making one feel a precious warmth. A few figures, shrouded in black robes, stood under the lanterns, silently watching the large ship that was sailing towards them. Qin Yu picked up the unconscious Mayanya. Senior, let's go. King Xuanzi's face was expressionless. He pushed open the door and walked out first. This scene attracted many shocked gazes. This was because, from the moment the ship went out to sea until now, the cabin Qin Yu and the others had never been opened. No matter what sort of sea attacks they faced, they had always remained silent. Although it was said that if they didn't risk their lives, there were still some people who were dissatisfied with their behavior. This was especially true when they entered the deep sea and the thick aura of death shrouded them. Of course, the incomparably beautiful Mayanya was also an important reason. In normal circumstances, the desperados would still retain their rationality. But under the aura of death, it was unknown how long they could live. So how could they have any scruples? Some people tried to open the cabin door, and they succeeded. It could even be said that they walked in without any effort. Then there was no then. All the desperados that entered the cabin disappeared inside, never to come out again. After several attempts, the cabin Chinyu and the others were and became a publicly recognized forbidden area. But now they actually came out on their own initiative. Was it because of the ship that appeared on the sea? The cold sea was vast, but there was only a single Black City. And the number of ships that could go out to sea in Black City was also limited. At that moment, the shivering desperados finally realized that the ship in front of them was a very unfamiliar one. It was not as big as the ship they were standing on, but it clearly had more outstanding abilities. It stayed in the cold sea without any ice on its surface. There were 4 black-robed people at the bow of the ship. They were dressed very thinly, and 2 of them were obviously women. Deep in the cold sea, a strange ship that appeared out of nowhere. 2 men and 2 women in black robes. Even if one used their knees to think, they knew that this was not simple. Thus, there was silence on the ship. No one spoke. Tung Hai could feel the gazes of the people around him. He was the one who had given the order to turn. Now, they had met another ship in the depths of the cold sea. If they said it was a coincidence, that would be an insult to their intelligence. But Tung Hai could not respond to this. If the existence of the Netherworld royal bloodline was leaked, he would have to pay with his life. In the silence, King Xuanzi walked in front, while Chinyu followed behind with Mayanya in his arms. Wherever they passed, the crowd automatically parted. Countless eyes were filled with confusion and awe. With a step, King Xuanzi, Chinyu, and Mayanya soared into the air, flying toward another ship not too far away. But the moment they soared into the air, the surface of the sea split open and a shadow shot out, shooting straight towards Chinyu. The shadow was slender like an arrow, its speed inconceivably fast. And what was even more terrifying was that no matter if it broke through the sea or tore through the air, it didn't make the slightest sound at all. This black shadow was like a real shadow, but shadows could also kill people. This was something Chinyu was well aware of. Moreover, the one that tore through the sea wasn't a shadow. It was dangerous, but Chinyu didn't panic. Pa! With a soft sound, the black shadow flew out and landed on the big ship behind. It was actually a long, pitch-black fish with the shape of a ribbon. Its head was extremely small, only the size of an adult's knuckle. Its eyes were even smaller, about the size of a grain of rice. But even with this astonishing speed, the ribbon fish's 2 eyes were pierced through, and then its entire head was torn apart. A fatal strike. Arrow ribbon fish. The complexions of countless desperados changed, panic filling their eyes. There were countless terrifying demon beasts in the cold sea, and they had encountered many before. But in terms of individual lethality, the arrow ribbon fish in front of them was second to none. It was like a horrifying killer hidden in the cold Black Sea. Once it chose its prey, it would explosively attack. Beneath the terrifying attack of the arrow ribbon fish, even a demon commander level powerhouse wouldn't have any room to resist. But now, this killer level demon beast of the cold sea had been slaughtered in the blink of an eye. In fact, they only saw a shadow flash in front of them, and then its corpse flew towards them. They had no idea how it died. King Xuanzi lightly said, "This fish is for you. Consider it compensation." Tung Hai bowed. "Thank you, my lord." His eyes were full of excitement. Although the arrow ribbon fish wasn't his goal, and his great business had ultimately failed, this arrow ribbon fish could still be sold for an astonishing amount of wealth. King Xuanzi didn't speak further. His figure flickered, and he landed on the opposite ship. Chinyu was a step slower. The moment he landed on the deck, he could feel a long-lost warm aura. It was released from the ship, dispersing the cold in the air. But thinking about it, this was also normal. Since the Netherworld King bloodline was hidden in the cold sea, there had to be a way to resist the cold. His eyes swept over the 4 people on the other side. There were 2 men and 2 women covered in black robes. Their auras weren't weak at all. As Chinyu observed them, the 4 people's eyes also fell on him. But soon they looked away and bowed together. "Greetings, great uncle." King Schwanza nodded. Let's go. The red, lantern-lit ship turned around and rapidly sailed deep into the cold sea. It soon turned into a red dot and vanished from sight. Tenghai took a deep breath. He shouted, "Return!" The ship arced through the air, heading in the direction of Black Castle. The lynx revealed a complex look. She wanted to say something, but hesitated. Tenghai turned around. His eyes swept over her and then fell on the other trusted aides. Don't ask what you shouldn't know. Even if he asked, it would be a waste of time. The smarter he was, the more he guessed, the faster he would die. That would force him to kill. However, at this moment, Qin Yu's figure subconsciously appeared in Tenghai's mind. What was the origin of this mysterious young man? What was his purpose in coming to the cold sea? Although Qin Yu had always been respectful towards King Schwanza, Tenghai didn't feel much fear from this respect. On the contrary, when King Schwanza faced him, he felt his hands and feet bound. He took a deep breath and suppressed his thoughts. He didn't want to think about things he shouldn't think about. He had just reminded others, so how could he make such a mistake again? No matter who Qin Yu was or what he wanted to do, it had nothing to do with them. The only thing they needed to consider now was to safely return to Black Castle. The reason Tenghai and the others were free was because someone had replaced their position. Facing King Schwanza's question, Qin Yu didn't give a perfunctory answer. Instead, he gave a serious answer. I want to enter the cold sea. But in fact, he was already in the cold sea. Moreover, it was an extremely deep and desolate region that very few people dared to enter. Even in this situation, he still gave such an answer. This caused a dignified expression to appear on King Schwanza's face. Qin Yu's goal was clear. He wanted to go deeper into the cold sea. As for where exactly he wanted to go, he didn't give an answer. To put it simply, it could be understood as the deeper the better. It was said before that with the strength of a true abyssal king, they could freely wander through the abyss. Besides super strong existences on the same level, there weren't many dangers that could threaten their safety. But the cold sea was one of them, and it was the most terrifying kind. The netherworld royal bloodline secluded itself in the cold sea. Out of all the races in the abyss, they should have the best understanding of just how terrifying it was. Many years ago, there was even a formidable true king with the netherworld royal bloodline that insisted on exploring the depths of the cold sea. In the end, he never returned. The result could already be predicted. Taking a deep breath, King Schwanza said, Qin Yu, I must remind you that the cold sea is far more terrifying than you can imagine. The terrifying cold in the depths is something that not even a true king can completely resist. Are you sure you want to continue deeper? Qin Yu bitterly smiled. He didn't have any masochistic tendencies at all. If he didn't have a choice, he wouldn't be willing to rush into the cold sea. But without accident, this incomparably terrifying cold sea that was located in the deepest depths of the abyss hid a channel to the vast Yang world. It was just that it was hidden deeper. With a dignified expression, Qin Yu earnestly said, I understand King Schwanza's meaning, but this junior does have a reason. This was a direct response. King Schwanza fell silent, but his heart was roaring. He should have known that following Qin Yu wouldn't be a good thing. Refuse he couldn't refuse, otherwise he would be violating his oath. In other words, no matter where Qin Yu went, he would have to brace himself and follow. If it were someone else, the truth was that King Schwanza wouldn't be too worried. He was a dignified, true king. So how could he not outlast a mere junior? Even if he went deep into the cold sea before the great horror arrived, just that terrifying cold would be enough to kill anyone below the true king realm. At that time, he would naturally be able to escape. But now, the person beside King Schwanza was Qin Yu. It was Qin Yu. Everything that happened in the nightmare ancestral land was still vivid in his mind. It was impossible for King Schwanza to view him as a simple junior. Pessimistically, in terms of life-preserving abilities, even if he died, that bastard Qin Yu would still be alive and kicking. This was truly a matter that left one helpless and indignant. King Xuance's face darkened. He flicked his sleeves and left. Qin Yu expressed sympathy for him, but that was only sympathy. His determination to return to the vast Yang world wouldn't waver in the least. "Greetings, King Xuance." The 4 men and women took off their black robes, revealing their true appearances. They bowed respectfully. Without outsiders present, they certainly didn't dare to call him uncle. The Netherworld royal bloodline was tyrannical, but the more it was so, the more strict the hierarchy was. The dignity of a true abyssal king could not be offended. With a gloomy expression, King Xuance quickly left. The 4 Netherworld royal bloodline juniors stood up. Their faces were filled with apprehension and suspicion. They thought that King Xuance's mood was very bad. And on this ship, besides them, there were only 2 people left alive. One of them was still unconscious. In other words, the one who caused all of this could only be Qin Yu. Just who was this boy? He angered King Xuance to such an extent, and yet he was still alive? Could it be that he was the direct descendant of some old monster? In the abyss, there were some terrifying existences that could be called taboos. They had lived for countless years, and their strength was so terrifying that even the Netherworld royal bloodline had to give them sufficient respect. Besides this, they couldn't think of any other explanation. As for King Xuance being controlled by others and having no choice but to swallow his anger, haha, what a joke. It wasn't funny at all, let alone thinking of this possibility. Even if this matter was made clear to these 4 Netherworld royal bloodline juniors, they still wouldn't believe it. True abyssal king. What was a true abyssal king? That was a terrifying existence that could cause the heavens to collapse and the earth to cave in, annihilating trillions of lives with a single thought. They were great characters that stood at the peak of the abyss. So how could they be controlled by others? Well, it was true that a true abyssal king could be controlled by others. As descendants of the Netherworld royal bloodline, their talent was good and they had some status in their race. They were qualified to know some secrets of the various abyssal races. But this absolutely wouldn't happen to a junior. Humph humph. Just Qin Yu's aura alone was inferior to theirs. The 4 Netherworld royal bloodline juniors glanced at each other and sighed with emotion. Reincarnation was indeed a skill. Their skills were good, but compared to Qin Yu, they were far worse. Chapter 1160. The 4 descendants of the Netherworld royal bloodline were envious and jealous of Qin Yu's reincarnation technique. Of course, they weren't convinced, but their emotions didn't affect their actions. While the 2 men were still thinking of ways, the 2 princesses of the Netherworld royal bloodline, who thought they were quite beautiful, took the initiative to attack. In fact, their thinking was very simple. Whether or not Qin Yu's identity could make King Xuance swallow his anger. Just this point alone was worth investing in. If something really happened, they could leave a good impression on each other. Then, after they found out Qin Yu's identity, they could advance or retreat and take the initiative. Of course, reality was very realistic, but this was also a survival instinct that the children of large families had to learn in the environment they grew up in. Cough, cough, of course. Taking a step back and looking at Qin Yu's current appearance, it wouldn't be too much to say that he was handsome. If he was really willing to do something beneficial to both their bodies and minds, the 2 princesses of the Netherworld would most likely not refuse. After all, the abyssal races were much more open to the matters between males and females compared to the vast Yang world. But reality was often crueler than one could imagine. The 18 skills that the 2 princesses had silently prepared didn't even have time to display before they were beaten black and blue. Qin Yu didn't say anything and directly refused them, but his expression was very indifferent and his eyes were even more indifferent. He was so indifferent that the 2 princesses suddenly felt like they were clowns on the stage. Shame filled their hearts, and they finally retreated. Of course, the princesses were full of fighting spirit. The more difficult it was to approach Qin Yu, the more valuable he was to them. Once they successfully approached this kind of person who was difficult to approach, the relationship they established would be incomparably strong. But before the two princesses could come up with a new plan, they were stopped by King Schwanz's gloomy face. Who was Chinyu? He and that old demon dragon, Offa, had been schemed against, and the shadow of betrayal had also fallen into his hands. Although he didn't like Chinyu to the extreme, King Schwanza had to admit that he was a character that couldn't be underestimated. Could such a person be won over by two little girls with a little honey trap? Haha, this was simply a joke. Chin, you could only laugh at the netherworld king bloodline in his heart. On the fourth day of the ship's journey, a vortex appeared in front of them. Chin Yu's eyes brightened, but before he could think further, King Schwanza appeared in front of him. This whirlpool is the royal bloodline's encampment. If you want to enter the depths of the frigid sea, you must make thorough preparations. Some crucial resources can only be found in the encampment of the royal bloodline. That was probably the explanation. Chin Yu nodded to express his understanding. He had already explained the reason before. He could completely trust King Schwanza. That old fellow wouldn't dare to harm him. The encampment of the royal bloodline? Chin Yu's eyes flashed. The ship had already sailed into the vortex. A suction force came from within, pulling them into the pitch-black cold sea. After 3 more days, the temperature of the frigid sea became even more terrifying, especially after entering the whirlpool. An invisible force isolated the seawater outside, and the red lantern hanging at the bow of the ship became brighter and brighter. A steady stream of warmth was released from the hull of the ship, fighting against the terrifying cold. Even so, one could still clearly see traces of pale white coldness gradually staining the surface of the ship and spreading outwards. If this continued, it would be difficult for the ship to escape its fate of being sealed in ice. Luckily, this situation didn't continue for too long. The darkness in front of him suddenly vanished, and a warm and bright light emerged. All of the cold was like an illusion, vanishing without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Chin Yu subconsciously narrowed his eyes, but he soon adapted. The light in front of him seemed to have been specially processed. Although it was bright, it wasn't blinding. Instead, there was warmth and gentleness everywhere. A floating island appeared in his line of sight. Around the island and below, there were white clouds like cotton candy, soft and white. All of the light and warmth was released from it. Looking up, all one could see was darkness as deep as ink. It was repelled by the light. If one didn't personally come here, who would have thought that in the depths of the frigid sea, a place like a fairyland was hidden in a whirlpool? Several beams of light flew over from the island. After confirming his identity, they respectfully bowed. "We welcome King Schwanza's return." King Schwanza nodded without expression. He looked at Chin Yu and said, "Chin Yu is my guest. Receive him well and don't neglect him." After he finished speaking, he nodded to Chin Yu. Then he took a step forward and his figure instantly vanished from sight. The new Nightmare King had been born, but he still hadn't returned. Of course, he had to give the royal bloodline an explanation for this matter. Chin Yu didn't know what King Schwanza would say, but it should be a perfect story. After all, such a long time had passed. It was more than enough for him to come up with an excuse to brush everyone off. As for whether or not the Netherworld royal bloodline believed him, that wasn't something Chin Yu needed to worry about. The several members of the Netherworld royal bloodline that flew out of the island all had different expressions. They had clearly seen King Schwanza's actions just now. Did a true king need to specially greet someone? His appearance was ordinary and his aura was also ordinary. Then there was only one possibility. This person's background was amazing, and it wasn't just an ordinary kind of amazing. King Schwanza didn't think that his subconscious action had already given Chin Yu's background a highly credible endorsement. "Your Excellency Chin Yu, welcome to Nether Island. Please come with us," a member of the royal bloodline said with a bright smile. The 4 members of the royal bloodline that had returned with the ship were immediately unhappy. What was the meaning of this? Did you want to throw us off and curry favor with Chin Yu? Humph, humph. Don't even think about it. Your Excellency Chinyu, we will receive you well. There is no need to trouble you, a princess coldly said. Then she turned around with a pleading look in her eyes. Your Excellency, can you come with us? In fact, it didn't matter to Chinyu who he went with. Then it would be these 4 people on the ship. It wasn't that Chinyu thought it would be easier to get along with them, but that these 4 people looked a bit stupid. It was unlikely that anything would happen to them. The 4 members of the royal bloodline were overjoyed, but if they knew that Chinyu had described them as stupid, they didn't know if they would still be able to smile. The Netherworld royal bloodline had secluded themselves from the world. The number of people that knew of their whereabouts in the dark abyss could be counted on one hand. For Chinyu to be brought back to Nether Island by King Xuanzi without hesitation, this alone was enough to show how much he valued him. Moreover, the 4 members of the royal bloodline on the ship, after their successful competition, caused the people that came from the island to believe that Chinyu's status was no trifling matter. We cannot go against King Xuanzi's will. Why must the 4 of you make things difficult for us? Humph! King Xuanzi already told us to take good care of your Excellency Chinyu. Neither side gave way to the other, and neither side could convince the other. Seeing that Chinyu had no intention of interfering, they could only take a step back and act together. Thus, following this, Chinyu truly enjoyed the treatment of a Wang Mai Chao VIP. Everything was properly arranged. Mianya had already woken up. As she followed behind Chinyu, her head was a little dizzy, but she also felt as if she had learned some incredible truth. Sir Chinyu really wasn't an ordinary person. Even the Netherworld King bloodline was fawning over him. Thigh, super invincible golden thigh. After doing this several times and confirming that he didn't need anything else, Chinyu reluctantly sent away the several enthusiastic members of the royal bloodline. He turned and sat down on a chair. He sighed and rubbed his temples. These fellows flattered him like a tide. Even if he wasn't tired, he was tired of listening to them. Before he could rub a few times, a cool and soft hand fell on his scalp from behind and began to rub. Sir, if you are tired, then take a rest. It had to be said that her skill wasn't bad. Chinyu felt very comfortable as he subconsciously leaned back in his chair. He never thought that, as he leaned back, he would first touch 2 soft and upright places. Chinyu coughed, not saying anything. Mianya blushed red. She moved back a little and then regretted it. It was rare for the young master to take the initiative, but she had actually moved back. What are you doing? Are you confused? If I went back up now, wouldn't it be too obvious? Would the young master not like it? After hesitating for a moment, Mianya took a deep breath and prepared to move. But Chinyu opened his eyes and waved his hand. All right, I'll be quiet for a while. You go and rest. Mianya's eyes revealed a trace of disappointment, but she didn't dare to object. She obediently nodded and returned to her room. Shwa, a sharp light flashed in Chinyu's eyes. The corners of his lips curved up in a smile. His eyes slowly swept around. Originally, he only had a 50 to 60% assurance that there was a channel deep in the cold sea. But now that he had experienced the Netherworld royal bloodline's retreat, he felt that he had at least an 80% chance of finding the channel back to the vast Yang world. This left Chinyu impatient, but no matter how anxious he was, he didn't lack time. King Xuanzi had clearly said that the depths of the cold sea were extremely terrifying and he had to be fully prepared. Not to mention anything else. Just based on this matter alone, Chinyu felt that King Xuanzi had no reason to deceive him. It was just that he didn't know how long this old fellow would need to arrange everything. Even if the people of the Netherworld royal bloodline couldn't see through his lies, they definitely wouldn't blindly believe everything he said. For such an important matter, he had spent a great deal of effort to arrange everything. But in the end, there was no harvest, so wrangling was inevitable. Reality proved that Chinyu wasn't wrong. For 3 days, he didn't see King Xuanzi again. Luckily, the Netherworld royal bloodline's care was still perfect and meticulous. It seemed that there weren't any major problems. This was good. As long as King Schwanza could remain calm, it would only delay him for some time. No matter how anxious Chinyu was, it was only a few days. It wasn't anything at all. As his mood settled down, Chinyu began to continue his previous hobby, looking at the heavens, looking at the earth, looking at the air. The Netherworld Royal Bloodlines Retreat Island was certainly not ordinary. The more he looked at it, the more interesting it became. Chinyu gradually became obsessed and didn't feel that time was passing by. On the 10th day of entering Netherworld Island, a weary king, Schwanza, finally appeared in front of him. As he looked at Chinyu's spirited appearance, he couldn't help but grit his teeth in hatred. In these 10 days, he had been completely overworked. Not only did he have to deal with all sorts of questions from his clan, but he also had to make arrangements. To explore the depths of the cold sea required a reason. The reason that King Schwanza gave was to search for the missing true monarch of his clan. It was a grand and lofty reason that no one could refuse. But it also meant that this was a cover. It wasn't that King Schwanza didn't want to find a more reasonable reason. It was because he simply didn't have any. As for Chinyu's identity and why he was brought back to Netherworld Island, King Schwanza simply said that he was an old friend and sent them away. There really wasn't any more explanation. With his true monarch realm cultivation, he had the qualifications to bring people onto the island. Since you asked, I will give you an answer, but that is all. As for whether or not you are satisfied with my answer, sorry, that is not within my scope of consideration. Sensing the dissatisfaction in King Schwanza's eyes, Chinyu smiled and poured a cup of hot tea for him. This tea is very good. Senior, please drink it before you speak. King Schwanza coughed. Do you think the tea of my Netherworld royal bloodline is good or bad? He picked up the cup and drank it all in one gulp. He said, the arrangements have been made. We will leave in 2 days. He looked at Chinyu. Do we really have to enter the depths of the cold sea? Chinyu nodded. You can't tell me your goal. Chinyu nodded again. Xian Su King was so angry that he gritted his teeth even more. This bastard was playing a deep game here. Just you wait. Wait for me. Thinking about it, there was still 100 years. This aggressive thought had just popped up, but in the blink of an eye, it was smashed into pieces. He tossed out a demon crystal and left behind information about the Netherworld royal bloodlines exploration of the cold sea. Then, King Schwanza calmly left. Chinyu probed it with his divine sense. Of course, it wasn't a complete record, but some of the information was still important. After he finished reading everything, he closed his eyes and thought for a moment. When he opened them again, they were much brighter. The depths of the cold sea, he hoped he wouldn't be disappointed. King Schwanza's words were worth believing. 2 days later, a carefully prepared ship left the Netherworld Royal Bloodlines Island. Yes, it was a large ship, even larger than Black Castle's. But on this ship, including Chinyu and Mayanya, there were only 7 people. Before King Schwanza, there were 4 members of the royal bloodline. These were the passengers of this ship. The space wasn't ordinary and bright. In comparison, King Schwanza's expression was solemn, and the faces of the 4 royal bloodline members were filled with excitement. They didn't know the true reason why King Schwanza wanted to explore the depths of the cold sea. But without a doubt this was an opportunity. There were dangers, and they weren't ordinary dangers. But with King Schwanza here, their safety was guaranteed. As long as they performed well and entered King Schwanza's eyes, their future would be bright. This was enough for them to take a gamble. Of course, there was another reason that made the 4 royal bloodline members feel at ease, a crucial reason. Chinyu and Mayanya were also on the ship. This was a simple truth. Chinyu's aura wasn't anything special, and he might not be stronger than them. If he wasn't afraid, then they definitely didn't need to be afraid. Of course, Chinyu's status was different, and he might have some hidden cards. But Mayanya was just a beautiful maid. How could her life-saving methods compare to theirs? Since Mayanya was brought along, that meant this trip was somewhat safe. If King Schwanza knew what these 4 juniors were thinking, he feared he wouldn't be able to help but curse them. What a bunch of idiots. How could they compare to Qin Yu? Even the little maid by his side couldn't compare to them. Don't be unconvinced, this is the truth. Believe it or not. Even I might not be able to survive these 2. Qin Yu held Mianya's hand. His expression was calm, and his heart was even calmer. At this moment, he didn't have any other thoughts. He simply felt that this would give Mianya a greater chance of survival, because she was left behind by Qin Yu, a chess piece to counter the Avatar. Although, strictly speaking, the Avatar would never betray the main body. Even the shadow of the abyss had betrayed him. What else was impossible in this world? In short, being cautious was the right choice. He Tiangang was Qin Yu's first chess piece in the light. Mianya was his second chess piece in the dark. The dark chess piece was, of course, more important. And the Avatar probably wouldn't have thought that Qin Yu would hand such an important matter to Mianya. He looked at the black, cold sea with a calm expression. This calmness contained the calmness of being able to face everything head-on. Qin Yu was truly prepared to accept any consequences. The large ship left the whirlpool and headed deeper into the cold sea. The big red lantern released its light, but it couldn't spread too far before it was swallowed up completely. In the darkness, the chill grew heavier and heavier. Chapter 1161. The ship that sailed out of Nether Island was called the Netherworld ship. Although this name wasn't very original, it didn't affect its powerful performance. Through the 4 members of the royal bloodline, Qin Yu was able to easily grasp the details of this ship. King Schwanza had indeed put in a great deal of effort to obtain the best ship that the Netherworld royal bloodline had ever built. Without a doubt, even though he was a true abyssal king, he still needed to pay a considerable price. After all, everyone knew that his excuse of entering the deep sea was nothing more than a pretense. On the 5th day, the Netherworld ship was very warm. The 4 members of the royal bloodline were filled with excitement. According to the ship's speed, it wasn't difficult to calculate the distance. Their current position was close to the limits of the royal bloodline's exploration of the cold sea, and there were no more than 20 people from the royal bloodline that had been here before. Just this point alone was enough to brag about their many years of experience. On the 10th day of sailing, the ship was still warm. It was just that the warmth had decreased a bit, giving off a feeling like a spring breeze. As the Netherworld ship broke through the pitch-black seawater and drew a long line, there were faint traces of frost on the part of the ship that came into contact with the seawater. The 4 members of the royal bloodline were responsible for maintaining the ship's course and checking its condition. This was their main job, so they naturally discovered this. Looking at the pitch-black sky and sea, they subconsciously frowned. As they looked at each other, they could see the worry in each other's hearts. On the 17th day of sailing, half of the hull of the Netherworld ship was covered in frost, and the temperature had clearly dropped. Moreover, what was most terrifying was that there was a chill in the air that couldn't be resisted. It constantly invaded one's body, and in order to ensure that they weren't affected, they could only constantly consume demonic energy to resolve it. On this day, besides King Schwanza, everyone on the ship was wearing a special cold-resistant clothing that was specially made for the Netherworld royal bloodline. The bright red clothing seemed very festive, like a burning flame. After wearing it, it felt warm, and the tense atmosphere on the ship immediately relaxed. On the 21st day of sailing, although it had only been 4 days, the chill of the cold sea had clearly risen by more than 1 level. This was because the entire surface of the Netherworld ship was covered in white frost. With the passage of time, this kind of cover was clearly becoming thicker and harder. The big red lantern at the bow of the ship was still lit, but the terrifying thing was that its light could only be maintained within the range of the ship. Once it radiated outside the ship, it would be swallowed up by the darkness. That's right, devouring was the right word to use. It was as if there were countless greedy mouths hidden in the darkness. They fed on light and fought to devour everything. It got colder. On the 26th day of the voyage, this distance had already far exceeded the recorded exploration process of the Netherworld royal bloodline. The large ship stopped in the sea because they had finally encountered the first cold sea creature that attempted to attack. The cold sea was in the depths of the abyss, so this creature was naturally a standard abyssal monster. The darkness outside the ship was a place where light could not enter. Thus, no one could see what this creature looked like. But that didn't stop them from clearly sensing how terrifying this cold sea creature was. Of course, it was terrifying. There was nothing much to say about it. A creature that could survive in a place like the frigid sea was absolutely not to be trifled with. Qin Yu couldn't see through the darkness, but he could still see those giant eyes hidden beneath the icy, cold seawater. Within that cold, cruel, and indifferent gaze, there was also a trace of fear. The object of this fear was, of course, King Xuanzi, who was standing at the bow of the ship, frowning as he stared at the darkness outside. After a long period of silence, those eyes in the frigid sea vanished, and the Netherworld ship continued forward. Even though the danger had been averted, the atmosphere on the ship had become even more solemn. Perhaps it was because of the cold or fear. The 4 members of the royal bloodline, the 2 men and 2 women, had pale faces and sunk into deep silence. Qin, you could feel Mianya's hand trembling. He looked at her and smiled. Don't worry, there won't be any problems. At the bow of the ship, King Xuanzi's ears pricked up. He frowned and almost couldn't help but jump up and curse out loud. There won't be any problems, your ass. He had never encountered that sea creature before, and its aura was so strong that even he found it difficult to deal with. Scaring it away could only be considered good luck. Otherwise, who knew what the situation would be like now? Qin, you could feel King Xuanzi's angry eyes. He lowered his head and didn't respond. This was because he knew that King Xuanzi had a good reason to be angry. Moreover, Qin, you couldn't change anything because of this, because the Netherworld ship hadn't arrived at its final destination yet. On the 30th day of the voyage, the Netherworld ship had turned into a giant lump of ice. The layer of white ice gradually darkened, nearly fusing into one with the cold sea. The black ice represented the invasion of darkness. Thus, the range of the light from the lanterns at the bow was reduced by a great deal. It was still able to cover around half of the ship's hull, but the rest was hidden in the darkness. Even though it was at the same time, half of the ship was shrouded in light and the other half was shrouded in darkness, as if they were isolated in 2 different worlds. No one thought about what would happen if they walked into the darkness and tried it. Even Qin Yu suppressed his curiosity. This was because as King Xuanzi looked into the darkness, even a blind man could clearly feel his heavy mood. The effect of the cold clothes was already negligible. After obtaining King Xuanzi's approval, the 4 royal bloodline members took out red crystals. After pouring in demonic energy, they burned them. The red flames fell onto the red cold clothes, illuminating everyone's faces. But this couldn't hide the fear that gradually filled their eyes. On the 39th day of the voyage, on the Netherworld ship that was still a lump of ice, the light from the lanterns could only cover the bow of the ship around 100 feet in radius. The 4 royal bloodline members and Mian, you couldn't persist any longer. This was because all the methods used to resist the cold on the ship had lost their effectiveness. After receiving the pills that King Xuanzi handed to them, the 4 royal bloodline members were well aware that after taking them, they would fall unconscious and fall into a state similar to suspended animation. Then they would either wait for their recovery or fall into eternal sleep. Of course, they were afraid. The 2 princesses' eyes turned red and their pale lips trembled several times, but in the end they didn't say anything. But the pleading in their eyes was obvious. No one wanted to die, and they were no exception. It was just that they knew that in today's situation, their attitudes wouldn't change anything. The 4 royal bloodline members fell into a deep sleep. Qin Yu looked at Mianya. I won't let you die. Mianya's smile was forced. She believed in Qin Yu's words, but sometimes a single person couldn't interfere with the progress of a matter. After she fell asleep, King Xuanzi asked in a low voice, "Qinyu, do you want to continue?" Qinyu nodded. Yes. On the 44th day of the voyage, King Xuanzi made his move. This time, the deep-sea creature that blocked the netherworld ship was clearly stronger. It was so strong that even when facing a true abyssal king, it still dared to have thoughts of hunting. A great battle ensued. A battle between true abyssal kings was carried out in the pitch-black skies. All Qinyu could do was protect Mianya so that she wouldn't be affected. As for the 4 royal bloodline members, he could only say sorry and hope that their luck was good enough. King Xuanzi returned wounded. The deep-sea creature that fought with him let out a pained and angry roar before its aura faded into the darkness. On the 45th day of the voyage, King Xuanzi opened his eyes. As he moved, the layer of ice covering his body instantly shattered into powder. He turned and looked at the 4 royal bloodline members. In the end, some of them had bad luck. There was a man and a woman. Their chests were deeply sunken in, and their heads were filled with frozen blood. Their auras were completely gone. Qinyu paled. "I'm sorry." Before he finished speaking, he was interrupted. King Xuanzi calmly said, "Life and death are decreed by fate. Your abilities are limited, so I won't blame you." He looked at Qinyu, his eyes faint. "Continue?" Qinyu was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. On the 46th day of the voyage, the lantern's light was forced to shrink to around 30 feet. The burning crystals on the deck had already been covered by a layer of ice. There wasn't the least bit of heat left. King Xuanzi looked at the surrounding darkness, his eyes becoming increasingly indifferent. Qinyu held Mianya tightly. This woman's aura was like a candle in the middle of winter, about to be extinguished at any moment. On the 47th day of the voyage, the ship was attacked again. This time, the battle ended much faster than before, but it was clear that King Xuanzi's condition was much worse. He should have used some sort of super strong hidden card to quickly repel the ice sea creatures. Sitting at the bow of the ship, within the 20-foot range of light, King Xuanzi looked at Qinyu. He was silent. King Xuanzi took a deep breath and slowly closed his eyes. But before he closed his eyes, his expression was even more indifferent than before. On the 48th day of the voyage, everything was quiet. It was truly quiet. The surrounding darkness was like a void. One couldn't even hear the sound of seawater being washed away. King Xuanzi was still adjusting his breathing. Qinyu held Mianya, his eyes looking at the darkness outside. His pupils were unfocused, and it was unknown what he was thinking. On the 49th day of the voyage, with a sigh, King Xuanzi opened his eyes. He looked at Qinyu beside him. It wasn't that the two of them were close enough to be this close. This was because the light of the lantern could only barely cover them. "Qinyu, I really don't want to come to this step, but I have no other choice." His voice was calm and his eyes were even calmer. If indifference was a kind of emotion, then there was no emotion at all in his eyes right now. Qinyu turned his head. His neck made cracking sounds, and his frozen joints began to rotate like a rusty machine. After a brief pause, he asked, "Does Senior want to kill me?" King Xuanzi said, "I don't want to, but I don't want to. Otherwise, all of us will be buried in the cold sea." As he spoke, the range of the lantern's light began to shrink. At this moment, the feeling it gave off was like a great mouth that was slowly closing. When the mouth closed, it was time to enjoy the delicious food and chew on it. King Xuanzi didn't know what was hidden in the darkness, but he wasn't curious at all. If it was before, he thought that the missing true king of his clan might have been trapped somewhere. Now, this thought had been completely shattered. The depths of the cold sea, there was truly a great horror within. Even a true abyssal king would perish here. He said he would kill, but he didn't. In fact, this was the last chance he gave Qinyu. He was silent. It wasn't that he didn't want to leave, but that he couldn't. Otherwise, Unless he abandoned the old turtle, it would be impossible for Qin Yu to return to the vast Yang world. This was his first time entering the cold sea, and it would likely be his last. This was because Qin Yu didn't believe he had the courage to rush in again. Don't look at how he was still alive right now. The pain he had to endure was something that no one could understand besides Qin Yu himself. A knife cutting through flesh was a kind of excruciating pain. But right now, Qin Yu was withstanding an onslaught of extreme cold that was at least 1,000 times more intense. This was a hellish experience. King Xuanzi glanced at the darkness that nearly touched his robes. He lifted a hand and grabbed Qin Yu's neck. As long as he spat out a bit of strength, his life aura would be completely erased. To do this, King Xuanzi would certainly have to withstand the backlash of his oath. It would even cause irreparable damage to the true king realm. But between life and death, no matter how difficult the consequences were, they would become simple. Blue veins bulged out on the surface of his palm. At this time, Qin Yu suddenly said, "Are you listening?" King Xuanzi stopped, because at this moment there really was a sound coming from the darkness. Although it was weak in the absolute silence, he could still clearly make out what it was. This was the sound of flowing seawater. Qin Yu suddenly smiled. As he looked at the darkness that was so close, a brilliant light bloomed in his eyes. Ever since he had experienced the Netherworld Royal Bloodline's refuge, he had believed that he would definitely be able to find the channel to the vast Yang world. But now it seemed that he had really found it. King Xuanzi's complexion changed. He could clearly feel the ship being pulled forwards, its speed starting to accelerate. Vortex, a massive vortex. It was so large that as it spun, it caused the seawater to roar and roar. The sound it emitted pierced through the terrifying darkness and spread into their ears. Instinctively, a thought appeared in King Xuanzi's mind. The vortex they were about to arrive at was the center of the cold sea. What was inside? Could it be the same as the Netherworld Royal Bloodline? Could there be a hidden paradise-like place hidden within? But soon, a trace of fear rose up from the depths of his heart, causing King Xuanzi to stiffen. At the same time, his impulse to investigate was instantly shattered. He could not enter a vortex. If he did, he would die, even if he was a true abyssal king. And what Qin Yu was looking for was clearly this vortex. Did he want to die? Qin Yu smiled. He looked at King Xuanzi and said, "Senior, there is no need to take the risk of killing me. Let go." When his fingers left his neck, he looked down at Mianya in his arms. "I will leave this woman to Senior's care. If possible, have her stay on Netherworld Island. I believe that with Senior's care, she will definitely be able to survive." King Xuanzi took a deep breath. "You want to go in?" "Of course," Qin Yu calmly said. "What I am looking for is this vortex." King Xuanzi's lips moved, but he didn't make a sound. This was because he knew that even if he asked, he wouldn't get an answer. "Leave her to me." Qin Yu smiled and nodded. He placed Mianya on the ground and took a deep breath. He struggled to stand up and face the darkness and suddenly smiled. "No, I don't have any strength left. I will have to ask Senior to help me." He lifted a hand and pointed towards the direction of the vortex. "It's there. Didn't Senior want to teach me a lesson a long time ago? This is the best chance. Let's do it." King Xuanzi didn't hesitate at all. He lifted his leg and kicked out. With a loud bang, the layer of ice covering Qin Yu's body shattered. He was like a stone as he submerged into the darkness. Puff! There was an extremely subtle sound. If one didn't listen carefully, they wouldn't have been able to detect it. King Xuanzi lifted a hand and pressed down. He roared out loud, and the Netherworld ship rumbled from within. With the eruption of a true king's full strength, it finally broke free from the suction of the vortex and began to slowly sail away. Looking back at the vortex, King Xuanzi was silent. He really did hate Qin Yu and wished that he could personally crush him to pieces. But he couldn't help but acknowledge that after confirming the existence of the vortex, the courage Qin Yu displayed was far greater than his own. "Brat, this kick can be considered as this king's additional gift for your courage. Even though I really don't want to see you again, if it's possible, then live on. At least that way, this king will still have the chance to know what exactly is hidden in the whirlpool at the center of the cold sea. Chapter 1162. What was hidden in the vortex at the center of the cold sea? If Qin knew what Monarch Xuanzi was thinking right now, he would definitely bitterly smile. Because besides darkness and icy cold, he couldn't find anything. He could only helplessly be wrapped up in the seawater and sink downwards. There was no end, and he couldn't see any hope. As for the extreme cold, it was rapidly destroying the vitality within his body. If Qin Yu had to say what he discovered, it would be that the cold and the darkness was extremely, extremely terrifying. If it weren't for the great sun's shadow hiding within his body, he would have already lost his life the moment he entered the cold sea. But even the shadow of the sun couldn't completely resist the invasion of the extreme cold. This caused him to walk step by step towards death, and as he was pulled deeper and deeper into the cold sea by the vortex, the speed of his steps became faster and faster. Kacha! Kacha! He could clearly hear the sound of ice forming on the surface of his body. It was this sound that reminded Qin Yu that he was still alive. But as for how long he could live, he had no idea. But thinking about it, with the current situation, it definitely wouldn't be long. If Qin Yu could smile, he would be bitterly smiling. Unfortunately, his entire body was sealed in ice, and he couldn't even reveal a single expression. The first to lose feeling was his hands and feet. Then a numb and sore feeling spread throughout his body like ants crawling all over him, slowly spreading to his chest and neck. Finally, the connection between his body and consciousness was completely stripped away, and his thoughts became increasingly slow. Had he made a mistake? Was there no channel in the vortex? Or was the channel hidden too deep? Before he could even find it, the extreme cold would take his life? Without the little blue lamp, even if a true abyssal king jumped into the vortex, he still wouldn't be able to last as long as Qin Yu. In other words, this was a dead end. To sum it up in a more philosophical way, regardless of whether or not there really was a channel in the vortex that led to the vast Yang world, if no one could find it, then it didn't exist. Qin Yu bitterly smiled. He thought that he really was done for. At this time, he still had the mood to think about philosophical questions. In the end, he had failed. Should he give up? Before Qin Yu entered the cold sea, he knew that it was extremely dangerous. Moreover, he wasn't sure whether or not he could find the channel. In this sort of situation, he would certainly leave a path of retreat for himself. Before he went to sea, he had given Old Fox an iron box. This was Qin Yu's path of retreat. Although Qin Yu didn't sit on the position of Nightmare King for too long, this didn't stop him from drawing upon the strength of the Nightmare race to create a life-saving card. According to the Nightmare Demon race, this should be called the Box of Rebirth. Qin Yu didn't know the exact principles behind it, but there was no doubt that it consumed a terrifying amount of resources. If it weren't for the fact that the Nightmare race was powerful and affluent, a small Abyss race might not have been able to do it, even if they exhausted the entire race's power. However, even with such a terrifying amount of resources, the Box of Rebirth did not have a 100% success rate. This was because interfering with life and death itself was filled with inconceivable possibilities and uncertainties. Qin Yu had carefully looked through this information. In this aspect, the chances of success and failure were around 50%. In other words, once the Box of Rebirth was activated, there was a 50% chance that he would be resurrected in Black City. The remaining 50% would be darkness, and he would never wake up again. In addition, Qin Yu had another worry. He himself wasn't a native life form of the Abyss, so it was unknown whether or not the Box of Rebirth, a treasure unique to the Abyss, would have any miraculous effects on him, or would it even have any miraculous effects. In short, according to Qin Yu's own calculations, he only had a 30% chance of successfully resurrecting. It wasn't that Qin Yu didn't want to prepare an even more formidable card for himself. In fact, this was already the limit of what he could do. In a hopeless situation, A 30% chance of surviving was already quite good. But even if he succeeded, so what? The little blue lamp had spent a great deal of effort to plot against the will of the abyss and seize the old turtle. Now he would have to stay in this vortex forever. Whether he died or not had nothing to do with him. In any case, it was impossible for Chinyu to find the old turtle again. Chinyu wasn't willing to accept such a loss. The little blue lamp had always said that his luck was reliable in critical moments. He didn't believe that it would fail this time. His thoughts became increasingly slow, so slow that fear rose up in Chinyu's heart. This was because his consciousness could fall into a frozen state at any moment, and the box of rebirth needed to be actively activated. Once one's consciousness froze, they could only wait for death here. Although Chinyu had thought that even if he succeeded, so what if he didn't want to pay the price of losing the old turtle? The difference between being alive and being dead was still extremely great. As he had said many times before, as long as a person was alive, everything was possible. But once they died, everything was over. The great terror between life and death was something that one could never understand unless they personally experienced it. This was a powerful instinct to escape, so powerful that it could destroy anyone's mind and will. In the distant Black City, Ting Hai's ship had already returned. The heavy casualties had shocked everyone. Qin Yu's group of 3 hadn't returned yet. After Old Fox inquired about the situation, his complexion became increasingly dignified. He returned to his dwelling and held the iron box in his arms, holding it there motionlessly. Although Old Fox didn't know that this box was the legendary divine object, the box of rebirth, he knew that it was undoubtedly something extremely important to the young master. Shadowless Demon hid in the shadows of the courtyard. His eyes shined with a green and ominous light. Anyone that broke in would instantly be welcomed by him. He didn't hesitate to pay any price to wildly attack them. The good news was that the courtyard remained peaceful. No one tried to do anything. On a certain day, the box in Old Fox's arms suddenly trembled. His eyes widened. As the air twisted in front of him, Shadowless Demon's figure also appeared in the room. Under the gazes of the two, the iron box that had just trembled fell silent once more. Even so, after a short period of shaking, the iron box still emitted a hidden aura. This aura caused Old Fox and Shadowless Demon's hearts to shake. Their complexions became incomparably ugly. Although they hadn't seen the so-called divine artifact box of rebirth with their own eyes, as veteran demon commander powerhouses, they had still heard some news about it. When the box shook just now, the surging life aura that surged out was exactly the same as the legendary box of rebirth. But why did the shaking stop just as it started? Could it be that the young master's revival had failed? Qin Yu was still alive, although he would soon die. The reason the box of rebirth stopped revolving was because the little blue lamp sent out a consciousness fluctuation. It was simple and vague. It was clear that in order to transmit its strength to the depths of the cold sea, even the mysterious and formidable little blue lamp had placed a tremendous burden on it. Wait a moment. That's right, when translated, these 3 words were simple, clear, and forceful. Qin, you didn't even think about it. Of course, this was because his frozen consciousness couldn't move so quickly. Because of his trust in the little blue lamp, he instinctively responded and stopped activating the box of rebirth. Then nothing happened. Eternal darkness. Horrifying cold. These were still the only melodies beneath the cold sea. Qin, you didn't dare to wait any longer. This was because he really would die, and he certainly couldn't accept this result. He had to activate the box of rebirth. This thought suddenly became intense and firm. But at this time, something unexpected happened. Qin Yu's consciousness was frozen solid. Water at 0 degrees Celsius would freeze in an instant. Qin Yu's consciousness was frozen in the same manner. The difference of a single breath of time, or even shorter, was like 2 completely different worlds. One was fighting for a path to survival. The other was waiting for death. Of course, The latter was even more miserable. Qin Yu's final thought was that he was dead this time. Before he could even finish spinning around, he was frozen solid. In the depths of the pitch-black cold sea, a giant block of ice was being pulled down by the seawater. Down, 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 all the way down. Suddenly an undercurrent surged, blowing away this block of ice. It escaped the pull of the whirlpool and floated away in another direction. If this timeline continued, then the story could end ahead of time. But an unfinished ending was something that couldn't be done. Thus, an aura spread out from the block of ice. It seemed to be suddenly activated, forming a connection with the depths of the cold sea. In the next moment, the pulling strength of the whirlpool suddenly extended over. Like an invisible hand, it grabbed onto the block of ice. Down it continued to go down. After an unknown period of time, in the depths of darkness, a speck of light suddenly appeared. It was like the first arrow that pierced through the dark clouds. Then a second, a third, and more light came howling over. And as this block of ice was illuminated by the light, a great change arrived without warning, descending upon the entire abyss. The skies turned pitch black. A terrifying, oppressive aura instantly arrived. Countless abyssal races, whether they were strong or weak, even the true abyssal kings, felt a deep sense of fear beneath this oppressive aura, because this was the anger of the will of the abyss. And the source of this anger was because it suddenly discovered that one of its shadows had completely vanished from its senses. It wasn't that it had dissipated, but that it had become blank. What had become blank along with it was a trace of its source. Although it was a very small amount, to the will of the abyss, this was the first time in its countless years of existence that it had felt pain. This was because the loss of its source was like cutting away a piece of flesh with a knife, no matter how small it was. It was still excruciating pain. It was the will of the abyss, and the entire abyss was its body. It was impossible for its shadow to simply become blank, unless someone stole its shadow and stole its origin. Death, death, death. At this moment, the trillions of abyssal beings could clearly feel the killing intent and anger of the will of the abyss. In the center of the cold sea, above the giant whirlpool, a thunderclap resounded in the darkness. Trillions of bolts of lightning tore through the skies. For the first time, lightning broke through the darkness, revealing the world of eternal night to everyone. An incomparably massive face appeared in the skies. It looked at the giant whirlpool and suddenly reached out a hand. 5 fingers clenched. Dong! At this moment, the entire cold sea began to boil. Monstrous tsunamis formed, wildly erupting outwards. In the depths of the cold sea, the light that shined on the lump of ice had already sensed something the moment the giant face in the skies moved. Endless light erupted. It was like a great sun that had used up all of its strength to leap out of the sea, releasing its own light to its heart's content, illuminating the entire world. At this time, light was omnipresent. Then, after this light and the lump of ice, the howling darkness heavily collided. No one could describe the terror of this collision, because it had already surpassed the scope of all words. Compared to this, the true Abyssal King was as fragile as an eggshell. Even if it was just brushed by a tiny bit, it would be smashed to pieces. Kacha! Kacha! With a dense series of cracking sounds, countless cracks appeared on the surface of the lump of ice. But now, it wasn't the only one emitting cracking sounds. This was because not too far away, there was a second lump of ice. Its fate was even more miserable. It was directly shattered into countless pieces by the shock waves of the collision. Traces of dark red gushed out from the fragments. Before they could be swept away by the shaking seawater, they were wildly absorbed by the first lump of ice. Reality was often more mysterious than a script. This was because any accident or change could lead to a completely different result. But in the end, what fate gave them was the most inconceivable answer. The lump of ice absorbed the dark red lump of ice. Then it was struck by the shaking seawater, constantly drifting towards that endless light. Chapter 1163. Ever since Black City was established, it had never considered that it would one day welcome a catastrophic tsunami. So, when it truly arrived, the cruel and ruthless Black City was instantly overturned. The docks outside the city were instantly torn apart in front of the monstrous waves. Ships that had the qualifications to enter the cold sea were overturned and swallowed up by the sea. Countless desperadoes were dumbfounded. They stood in the ruins of the city, their eyes simultaneously looking towards the depths of the cold sea. Over there, the darkness that was as thick as an eternal night was now being torn apart by thunder. Even though they were separated by an endless distance, they could still feel the destructive aura that was so thick that it nearly materialized. No one knew what was happening, but without a doubt, the tsunami that came crashing down and destroyed all of Black City was related to what was happening beneath the thunder. Teng Hai had always thought that he was brave. Even when he was on the ship and was besieged on all sides, he was still able to maintain his calm. But now his entire body was shivering uncontrollably. His cold and resolute face didn't have the least bit of blood left. Without a reason, he subconsciously thought back to Qinyu, who had left with King Xuanzi. Could this be related to him? Just what had they done? On the tumbling sea, the giant netherworld ship seemed incomparably small. It was like a small boat that could be overturned at any moment and torn to pieces by the waves. King Xuanzi stood at the bow of the ship. The aura of a true monarch erupted, helping the netherworld ship resist the terrifying strength that swept in from all directions. He looked back at the thunder tearing through the darkness. Vaguely, he could see an angry and fierce face. This was the manifestation of the will of the abyss. He fiercely lowered his head and looked away. King Xuanzi's heart raced like thunder. He discovered that he had underestimated Qin Yu's background. Even the true body of the abysses had been disturbed. As a true abyssal king, he could certainly feel the anger coming from the will of the abyss. Could it be that Qin Yu even dared to scheme against it? Gulp, he subconsciously gulped. At this moment, even the dignified true abyssal king was frightened by Qin Yu's lawlessness. Did he not know how the word death was written? However, from what he could see, it seemed that the one suffering a loss was the will of the abyss. This result was simply unimaginable. The will of the abyss. This was the will of the abyss. Just what kind of existence could scheme against him? Monarch Xuanji's complexion was cloudy and uncertain. But there was one thing he knew, and that was that he absolutely could not expose the fact that he had helped Qin Yu enter the vortex. Otherwise, not only him, but the entire netherworld royal bloodline would be torn to pieces by the berserk will of the abyss. Fortunately, only he and Qin Yu knew about this matter. As long as he kept his mouth shut, there was a high chance there wouldn't be a problem. As for Qin Yu, although he did not know what he had done, since he had angered the will of the abyss, even if he was willing to be a coward and hide in a place where even the will of the abyss would not be able to sense him, it was only a matter of time before he was killed. Unless he could escape from the abyss, his pupils constricted. He felt that he had discovered a terrifying truth. Qin Yu, he took a deep breath and hurriedly suppressed all his thoughts. His heart beat faster and his mouth became dry. He felt even more bitter. If this was true, then he was a traitor to the abyss. Once he was exposed, he would inevitably suffer a miserable fate. He looked down at Mayanya, a cold light in his eyes. This girl was Qin Yu's woman. If he allowed her to live, she would be a disaster. But soon, this killing intent that had just risen was suppressed deep within his heart. Although he didn't want to admit it, Monarch Xuanji was filled with dread towards Qin Yu. This was a person that dared to scheme against the will of the abyss. Who knew what else he couldn't do? Killing Mayanya was simple. But what if one day in the future Qin Yu came to ask him for her? That would be a great joke. Forget it. He would bring this woman back to Nether Island and place her under house arrest. With her strength, she wouldn't be able to stir up any waves. The unconscious Mayanya didn't know that she had already circled around the gates of hell. just like how Qin Yu didn't know that he had entered the gates of hell and was forcefully pulled back out. So, the moment his consciousness froze and the remaining half of his thoughts finally finished, he thought he had died. Then, I didn't die. I actually didn't die. He fiercely stood up. Qin Yu discovered that he was currently in a void of nothingness. With him as the center, there was a vertical line that neatly divided this void into two. The left half shined with light, warm and dazzling. It gave Qin Yu a familiar and intimate feeling. With just a glance, he was able to determine that this was the aura of the vast young world. The right half was pitch black like ink, as deep as an eternal night. Cold and cruel killing intent filled the air, and he could almost hear countless mournful cries in his ears. This was the power of the abyss. Before Qin Yu's pleasant surprise of resurrection could spread out, he froze where he was. He didn't dare to move. This was because Qin Yu discovered that he seemed to be at a strange equilibrium point formed by the collision of two different strengths. Any slight movement could break this balance, and the result would naturally be that the two forces would explode. The left side was light, the right side was darkness. One side came from the vast young world. The other side was the terrifying abyss. Of course, Qin Yu didn't know how powerful the collision between the two sides was, but he knew that it would be a simple matter to grind him to dust. The only thing that comforted Qin Yu was that the balance between the strengths of light and darkness seemed to be maintained very well. In other words, as long as he didn't do anything stupid, at least for now, there wasn't too much danger. This was a great fortune amidst misfortune. 3 days later, after Qin Yu carefully probed, he discovered that the equilibrium was very small. It was only 10 feet around him. If he exceeded it, there was a chance that a war between light and darkness would erupt. Although the usable area wasn't too great, at least Qin Yu didn't need to stand still. He could move his body and even take a few extravagant steps back and forth. Of course, he had to be careful with every step he took. He absolutely didn't dare to approach the edge, because what if the equilibrium shrunk? Because taking a stroll would cause him to die. This sort of humiliation that surpassed the heavens was something that Qin Yu absolutely could not accept. Another 3 days passed. Qin Yu looked at the light in front of him, a helpless look in his eyes. The vast young world was so close that he only needed to gently jump out and he could return. But in the current situation, this extremely short distance in front of him was an insurmountable moat for him. Moreover, the most serious situation was that Qin Yu discovered that whether it was light or darkness, these two incomparably powerful strengths didn't show any signs of dissipating as time passed. On the contrary, they were constantly condensing, like a vortex that constantly absorbed more and more of the strengths of light and darkness, causing the strength gathering outside the empty space to become increasingly strong. Simply put, if Qin Yu had courted death before, he might have been blown up and left with only a tiny bit of bone. But now, there wasn't even a bit of bone left. This was an extremely sad truth, but one that he had no choice but to accept. Qin Yu's complexion paled. This was because he discovered that although he was alive, it was as if he had been locked in a cage that he couldn't escape from. And what was even more terrifying was that as time passed, this cage became increasingly firm and terrifying. What should he do? I'm waiting online. But this was a question that no one could give Qin Yu an answer. He knew that the only one he could rely on right now was himself. In truth, there were always exceptions to everything. For instance, the current situation. The little blue lamp had lost contact with him once more. Perhaps it was because the strength of light and darkness had gathered here, forming an empty space that completely isolated Qin Yu's aura. Of course, the greater possibility was that this fellow saw that the situation wasn't right and decided to hide on his own initiative. After all, what Qin Yu faced now was the double coverage of vast yang and the power of the abyss. This was something that he had always avoided. But besides the little blue lamp, Qin Yu could also find someone he could consult. In the world of his mind, as Qin Yu's thoughts turned, the old turtle was directly pulled in. The first words he spoke were as he cried out, "Chinyu, if you don't want to live, don't drag me down with you. I haven't lived enough yet." The Death King truly lived up to his reputation. Chinyu narrowed his eyes. It wasn't because of his anger, panic, or disrespect, but because he discovered that the old turtle could actually sense what was happening outside. He was truly worthy of being a formidable existence that even the will of the abyss dared to betray because of his fear of death. This should be an ability that he had forcefully evolved in order to preserve his life. "If you don't want to die with me, then help me think of a way to leave here alive." The old turtle screeched, "You ask me, but who am I supposed to ask? These are two diametrically opposed strengths of two worlds. In an extremely rare situation, they have formed an extremely strong seal. Moreover, as time passes, more and more world strength will condense." Before he finished speaking, he was interrupted by Qin Yu's sneer. His expression was icy cold and his eyes even colder. He stared at the old turtle and slowly said, "It looks like you have forgotten who your master is. Do you believe that if you say another word, I will break you to pieces on the spot? Here it comes again. You want to break me every time you open your mouth. This is simply going too far. This is unbearable." But the old turtle didn't say anything, so he could. With a face full of grievance, the old turtle carefully said, "Of course, you are my master. I was just too scared and lost my mind for a moment, so I spoke without thinking. Master, please don't bother with me." Qin Yu sneered. "Now you've sobered up? Then let's get to the point. How can I leave? If you can't come up with something, humph, I will break you to pieces." The old turtle shivered and nearly cried. Could he change his catchphrase a little? These words were just too frightening. Even if he wanted to cry, he had to endure it. Qin Yu was extremely impatient right now. He feared that if he delayed for too long, he would really be broken to pieces. The King of Death's thoughts were that he couldn't take the slightest risk. Anything that could threaten his life had to be eliminated. His thoughts raced. The fear of death was an incomparably powerful driving force. Over the countless years, this driving force had constantly spurred him on. The old turtle was no longer a simple shadow. That's right, the old turtle only contained an extremely small portion of the abyssal source energy. But this portion of source energy had already undergone a mutation. Or it was more accurate to say that it had begun to evolve on its own. It was like a piece of flesh and blood with formidable vitality, constantly dividing and multiplying in an attempt to perfect itself and finally form a complete life. Of course, perhaps the old turtle himself didn't realize this. He was only instinctively moving in this direction. He was the shadow of the abyss, so he would never be free. If he wanted to break free from the shadow of death, transforming himself into an independent life form was certainly the only and best choice. Although the old turtle was still an incomparably long distance from completing his transformation, he had at least stepped onto this road. This was the true reason why the little blue lamp didn't hesitate to take risks to seize it. It didn't allow Qin Yu to easily abandon it. This was because the value of an abyssal source that had already begun to evolve far surpassed itself. Evolution, that meant infinite possibilities. In short, the King of Death's old turtle wasn't as simple as he seemed on the surface. Thus, when Qin Yu asked this question, under the threat of the terrifying shadow of death, he actually thought of something vague. "Master, don't worry. I've already thought of it, but it's a bit vague. It seems to be hidden too deeply. Please give me a bit more time." The old turtle was pale and beads of sweat covered his forehead. It was clear that it was taking a lot of effort to think of these things. In fact, it was certainly taking a lot of effort. This was because what the old turtle was doing was the same as competing with the will of the abyss. They were competing for the memories that belonged to them. Strictly speaking, the old turtle and the will of the abyss came from the same source. After the source developed the ability to evolve, the two of them were on the same level. Of course, this was only in terms of the same level of existence. In the true sense of the difference in strength, It was so great that it left one in despair. But what they were competing in now wasn't who was stronger. In addition, the will of the abyss had been caught off guard and had a portion of its memories stolen. Who? Who? The old turtle gasped for breath. His face was pale, but his eyes were filled with joy. Master, I've thought of it. He didn't know how shaken Qin Yu's heart was right now. Seeing Qin Yu's expressionless face, he only thought that Qin Yu was impatient and didn't dare to brag about it. Then he spoke in bits and pieces, pausing from time to time. The old turtle said many things, but the general summary was that it wasn't impossible to leave this cage. In fact, the method was very simple. That was to become a part of light and darkness. Since everyone was the same, Qin Yu would also become a part of the balance. Naturally, he wouldn't break it, but this was how the world was. Although it sounded simple, to actually accomplish it was incomparably difficult. For instance, to become a part of light and darkness, disregarding how to do it. Just this matter itself was a paradoxical proposition. Light and darkness were polar opposites to begin with. They were two strengths that couldn't coexist. Whenever they met, they would fight to the death. To become light and to become darkness, why don't you just ascend to the heavens? But the old turtle only managed to seize this bit of memory. He had a pitiful expression on his face that said, "I've already tried my best, please don't break me." Qin Yu didn't suspect that the old turtle had done anything to him. He feared that with the title of Death King, he wouldn't dare to play any tricks on this matter. He waved his hand and sent the old turtle away. Qin Yu racked his mind. He felt that this matter was impossible, but he also discovered that it was the only solution. Light and darkness, darkness and light. This wasn't a fusion between two sides, but rather a fusion of light and darkness. This was likely a transformation that was a step beyond you and me. I and you, I am you, you are me. The difficulty of this wasn't normal. What should he do? After an unknown period of time, within the terrifying cage formed by the world's strength of Vast Yang and the dark abyss, Qin Yu slowly opened his eyes. His eyes flashed with a bit of confusion, as if he had grasped something. He looked up and then slowly looked down. With Qin Yu as the center, the entire cage was divided into two parts. This was the result of the strength of the two worlds reaching a balance, but light and darkness were like boiling oil and cold water. After both sides came into contact with each other, how could they maintain this sort of tranquility? Qin Yu didn't know the reason, but he faintly realized that if he could understand this point, then he might be able to find a way to become a part of light and darkness. What was it? He stared at the point where light and darkness met, his pupils dilating. Unconsciously, he fell into a deep contemplation. Chapter 1164. Between light and darkness, they weren't truly in a state of absolute stillness. Rather, they flowed. Or, to be more precise, they were in a process of mutual exchange. Of course, the phrase mutual exchange wasn't appropriate here, but between light and darkness there was indeed a flow. This was a fact that Qin Yu discovered after observing for a long time. And this was thanks to the fact that Qin Yu had been gazing into the abyss all this time and had just barely managed to peek into it. Otherwise, if it were anyone else, even if their eyes popped out, they still wouldn't be able to obtain any harvests. This was because in order to see the connection between light and darkness, one needed a pair of eyes that were good at capturing things. But it wasn't just a pair of eyes. And the most important factor was a sufficiently powerful soul with a keen perception. It was best if there were many other supporting factors as well. For instance, Qin Yu had fused with the source of the abyss and obtained the approval of the abyss. Although these things had been left to the one on the Nightmare King's throne, there were still some remnants of their influence. In addition, there was the sun and moon force field, the jade embryonic egg, the cosmic sea cross bell, and even Qin Yu's own talent. Combining all of this together, it allowed him to truly understand the extremely complex relationship between light and darkness. It really was very complex. They were completely different and stood in opposition to each other. But light and darkness could remain calm and even flow together. When light fused into darkness, an equal quality of darkness fused into light. When light fused into darkness, it became darkness. When darkness fused into light, it became light. It was difficult to pronounce and even wordy, but it was something that had to be explained here with a great deal of ink. But why was it like this? The confusion in Qin Yu's eyes deepened and his pupils became even more lax than before. Even though he saw all of this, he didn't know the reason. This was like a difficult calculation problem. Even if he gave a clear and correct answer, if he didn't know the process of calculation, he would still be left confused. Qin Yu subconsciously reached out a hand. His 5 fingers grasped the air as if he were trying to grasp something. Vast young world. Endless fog lingered about, hiding most of the Green Mountain within. It was like a bubble, a phantom that didn't exist in this world. Sunlight sprinkled down on the mountain summit, on a wide and soft reclining chair. There was a lazy woman who seemed to have just woken up. This woman was beautiful, but she was like a green mountain. She gave off a strange feeling, as if she were far away, unfathomable. At this moment, in her half-asleep state, she opened her mouth slightly and let out a murmur, "Stupid!" He wondered if she was talking in her sleep. But the clouds that filled the sky proved that this woman was not dreaming, because as her voice fell, the clouds outside the mountain began to boil. It was truly boiling. The originally gentle, calm, and harmless clouds were violently shaking at this moment. As a result, the half-hidden Qingshan's connection with the heavens and earth was completely severed. At that moment, the woman on the reclining chair opened her eyes. Her eyes were as beautiful as the stars in the sky. Is the secret of the origin something that a little fellow like you can decipher? There was a hint of helplessness and pride in his tone. In this realm, even an existence that was only able to grasp the source of consciousness was already considered extremely outstanding. Not to mention, that kid didn't just realize it, he clearly saw the traces of the origin laws operating. Just this point alone showed that even though his cultivation was still lacking, the talent that this kid displayed was already not inferior to anyone he knew, as expected of someone she had personally chosen. At least he did not disappoint her and did not embarrass her too much. On account of this, he decided to lend him a hand. If he was lucky, this brat might even be able to obtain a huge surprise. Perhaps he was thinking too much. After all, obtaining a surprise was not something that could be easily done. Forget it. Just treat it as a thought. If he obtained it, then he would be lucky. If he failed, then there would be no regrets. The only thing she felt a little helpless about was that if she did this, she would use up a lot of the strength that she had painstakingly accumulated. Lying on a comfortable chair and basking in the sun in a half-awake state must be very tiring. That's right, that's how it should be. After confirming that she was indeed very tiring, the woman revealed a trace of helplessness and sadness. If this continued, when would she be able to successfully leave this mountain? Forget it. Thinking so much is useless. I hope that this kid will not let me down and waste all of my hard work. Of course, I still have to add a thick line to the bill. Humph. I have to make this kid remember that it is not easy to take advantage of me. It was unknown what she thought of, but the woman's eyes revealed a trace of anger. Then she snorted and lifted her hand. Her fingers were long and slender. They were truly beautiful, but such a beautiful finger actually contained an unimaginable strength. Dong! With a dull sound, the entire mountain trembled. A visible ripple spread out from where the woman's finger touched. When it had almost covered the entire Green Mountain, it suddenly shrank into a single point at a shocking speed. Then, a clear finger mark appeared in front of him. One could even see the fingerprints contained within it. In the next moment, the finger mark disappeared. It was like a shadow vanishing from this world. The cage of light and darkness. Compared to before, it had become much more solid and terrifying. Qin, you lay down on the point of balance, looking up at the black and white dividing line. The blood vessels in his eyes expanded because they were congested with blood, causing his eyes to turn red and filled with exhaustion that couldn't be concealed. Observation consumed energy, and the amount of energy consumed wasn't a small amount. Moreover, Qin Yu wanted to unravel the question about the exchange of the powers of light and darkness. Without a doubt, this greatly increased the rate at which he used up his energy. He couldn't last much longer. Qin Yu sighed inwardly. He didn't know how much time he had wasted, but it was the same as before. There was no harvest at all. Everything seemed futile, as if he were trying to decipher a question that he would never find an answer to. This undoubtedly left one in despair. Qin Yu was no exception. It was just that his heart was strong enough to suppress these emotions. When his consciousness was frozen by the extreme cold, he thought he was going to die. To be able to survive in the end was already a blessing in disguise. Even if he died in the end, he would still have lived for a very long time. Moreover, Qin Yu still had a chance to choose to release a very, very large firework before he died. The strength of the vast Yang and Dark Abyss worlds continued to gather, increasing in number. Once it exploded, the might would surely be terrifying. This would be a massive firework. Perhaps when I die, I might even cause the two worlds to shake. Ha ha ha, that would really be amazing. Like the old turtle, enduring the loneliness and living in this cage. That wasn't Qin Yu's style. Rather than living like this, he might as well die a glorious death. As he muttered to himself, Qin Yu closed his eyes. In the blink of an eye, he fell into a deep slumber. Several breaths of time after Qin Yu fell asleep, in the void in front of him, an extremely faint fluctuation slowly appeared. The light and darkness that maintained the balance began to gently shake, releasing a destructive aura. But in the end, the calamity didn't arrive. The strength of light and darkness gradually calmed down. In the void, as the fluctuation spread out, a delicate finger mark appeared. Without hesitation, it fell directly between Qin Yu's eyebrows. Pa! There was a light sound, as if someone had slapped him. His flesh and blood slightly caved in, as if a slender finger had touched the point between Qin Yu's eyebrows. Bang! In that moment, it was like a world had exploded in Qin Yu's mind. His slumbering consciousness simply didn't have time to respond before it was torn to pieces. There was chaos. There was no light, no darkness, no time, no space. Everything was at its original starting point. In this state of chaos, he didn't know how many years had passed. Then, Qin Yu's consciousness suddenly awakened. But before he could be shocked or curious as to why he had appeared here, the world in front of him began to change. The chaos was divided in two. Half turned into light, dazzling, and the other half turned into darkness, cold and cruel. This scene was like a bolt of lightning that crossed through endless space and time. It struck Qin Yu's consciousness and tore apart the endless sea of fog that covered his mind. The reason why light and darkness could fuse and exchange was because they were fundamentally the same. It seemed like it was only a thin layer of paper. But if it weren't for this scene in front of him, Qin Yu would have never imagined that there would be such a relationship between the diametrically opposed attributes of light and darkness. The chaos was divided in two, becoming light and darkness. One rose up and the other slowly sank down. On the foundation of light and darkness, the outlines of the two worlds appeared. As time passed, they began to evolve little by little. Qin Yu tried to open his eyes wide, wanting to clearly see the evolution of the two worlds. But the more he tried, the more blurry the scene became. Although he couldn't feel his own eyes, he still felt an unbearable sourness. He couldn't help but close his eyes. When Qin Yu opened his eyes again, he could see the dividing line between light and darkness above his head. He lifted a hand and touched his eyes. Sure enough, tears were flowing down. The sour feeling hadn't completely disappeared. Qin Yu lifted a hand and rubbed it. Then he pinched the point between his eyebrows. Something was wrong at this moment. As he rubbed the point between his eyebrows, he seemed to touch something. It was cool and soft, just like a woman's finger. This feeling only existed for a moment before it vanished. But Qin Yu's complexion became even stranger. This was because he was sure that everything he experienced just now wasn't a dream. Since it wasn't a dream, then someone had helped him, allowing him to see the origin of light and darkness. To accomplish this was undoubtedly an extremely difficult matter, but Qin Yu just happened to know that there was someone beside him who had a high chance of accomplishing this. She was also a woman, Teacher Liao, or to be more precise, she was Teacher Liao's main body. Just who was she? It had to be known that the cage Qin Yu was trapped in was formed from the combined strength of the vast yang and abyss worlds. Even someone as mysterious and powerful as the little blue lamp had chosen to temporarily avoid it. Yet, she had dared to intervene, and it seemed that she had succeeded. Qin Yu didn't know that when the finger mark arrived, the strength of the two worlds had nearly erupted. Otherwise, he would have been covered in a cold sweat. After all, to lose one's life in a deep sleep without the slightest reaction. This was simply terrible. Qin Yu took a deep breath and suppressed these complex thoughts. He looked at the darkness above his head and beneath his feet, his eyes shining with a bright light. Light and darkness were originally one. If one didn't see it with their own eyes, then how many people would dare to believe that vast yang and the abyss worlds existed? If one further diverged their thoughts, could they understand that the two hostile worlds were essentially the same? This was because the light and darkness that gave birth to them came from the endless chaos? If this was true, then the abyssal life forms and the people of the vast yang world were fundamentally no different. It was just that, because they lived in different worlds, they were endowed with different kinds of strengths. Was this the reason why Teacher Liao had such a different attitude towards the abyssal life forms? As he thought, she already knew all of this. You are the same, light and darkness are not different, then, if light is formed, then darkness is formed. Qin Yu whispered to himself and closed his eyes once more. But this time he didn't fall asleep. Rather, the scenes he saw before constantly replayed in his mind. In light and darkness, the passing of time lost all meaning. When Qin Yu opened his eyes again, he didn't know how much time had passed. But this wasn't important because between light and darkness, there was no concept of time. That's probably it. Qin Yu stood up. After a moment of silence, he stepped towards the light. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, he came to a stop. This was because this was the boundary of balance. Qin Yu took a deep breath. He lifted his foot and stepped forwards. He closed his eyes, nothing happened. Everything was calm as before. Success! After the tsunami, Black City was quickly rebuilt. What was rebuilt even faster was the pier by the frigid sea outside the city. Large ships swayed up and down with the waves. The conditions to enter the sea were ripe, but after the initial excitement, no one was willing to take the first step. Without a doubt, a great change had occurred in the frigid sea. It was likely a lucky chance, but it could also be a catastrophe. Old Fox's complexion paled. He left the pier. He had tried everything he could, but no one was willing to take him out to sea. Or, it was more accurate to say that in the next few months, the ships at the pier would be in a state of repair. After all, he had to give an explanation to the outside world to avoid appearing too cowardly. But cowardly was cowardly. Old Fox spat on the ground. Just as he was about to say something, his complexion suddenly changed. His figure moved, and he shot into the skies. Soon he returned to the inn and closed the door. Shwa! The shadows twisted, and Shadowless Demon appeared. What is it? Old Fox didn't have time to answer. He flipped his hand, and demonic light surged. A sealed iron box appeared in his hand. At this moment, the surface of the iron box lit up. Demonic runes wriggled and wove together as if they were alive, turning into 4 words. Wait for my return. Old Fox and Shadowless Demon glanced at each other. their faces filled with excitement. They simultaneously reared their heads back and laughed. They knew that nothing would happen to their young master. He was a character with a true king protecting him. How could he die so easily? Although they didn't know where Chinyu had gone. Since he had left behind these words, he would definitely return. From now on, Black City will be our home. We will wait here for the young master to return.